The morning had already begun to burn. Heat rose from the two-lane road that cut through Mason County like a blade, its surface shimmering under a white-blue sky. By 8 o'clock the sun was merciless, flattening color, bleaching rooftops, drawing the scent of tar and dust into the air. Naomi Cooper walked along the shoulder, with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a woman who had learned to pace her life against exhaustion. A week short of 8 months pregnant, she moved carefully, one hand resting on the swell beneath her faded hospital scrubs, the other gripping a canvas bag that contained her lunch tin, her stethoscope, and the smallest measure of pride that the night shift at County General could afford her. She had been on her feet for 12 hours. The hospital had hummed all night with the low, frantic music of overwork, ventilators sighing, monitors beeping, tired nurses trading half-sentences over cups of burnt coffee. Now, with dawn behind her and the promise of a bed ahead, Naomi's body ached in every joint. Her shoes, white once, now gray at the seams, pressed blisters into her heels. Yet she carried herself with that same quiet dignity that had seen her through the long months of double shifts and whispered judgments. A black woman in uniform, heavy with child, she was used to the eyes that followed her, some curious, some suspicious, most indifferent. In Mason County, difference was noticed before it was understood. The town itself was a place of contradictions. Brick storefronts sat beside boarded windows, church bells competed with the hum of a distant factory, and everywhere the smell of hot clay and diesel hung in the air. Naomi loved it and resented it in equal measure. It was the only home she had ever known, yet lately she felt it shrinking around her. Each week brought new rumors about budget cuts at the hospital, about who was being let go, about which part of town the sheriff's men were patrolling more aggressively. She knew the stories. They floated through waiting rooms and grocery aisles, stories of young men stopped for nothing, of women asked too many questions. She also knew that her husband, Sheriff Caleb Young, was trying to hold the line between law and fairness, but that line was wearing thin. At the corner of Laurel and Pine stood the small market where Naomi usually stopped for milk. The sign above the door blinked weakly in the sunlight, its neon tube giving up the ghost one letter at a time. She pushed the door open and was greeted by a gust of refrigerated air that smelled faintly of citrus and floor cleaner. Inside, the old ceiling fan turned like a tired prayer wheel. The clerk, Mrs. Danvers, looked up from her crossword and gave a polite nod, the kind of greeting reserved for someone known but not truly seen. "Hot one already," the woman murmured. Naomi smiled. "Feels like the sun's got something to prove today." She took a bottle of water from the cooler, the condensation slick against her palm, and lingered a moment in the chill before stepping back into the blaze. Outside, the air hit her like a wall. The road ahead stretched empty toward the fields that bordered their small house on the edge of town. She had half a mile left to walk. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and started forward, counting her breaths the way she did during contractions at the maternity ward. Slow inhale, slower exhale. Somewhere behind her a siren chirped once, then cut off. The sound barely registered. Patrol cars came and went all morning in Mason County, but when the low rumble of an engine eased up beside her, she glanced sideways out of habit. A white cruiser rolled parallel to her steps, its windows down, the county emblem catching sunlight. 2 uniformed men sat inside, young, broad-shouldered, the kind of confidence that comes from a badge worn too easily. One, the driver, leaned out the window with a grin that was meant to be friendly but wasn't. "Mornin', ma'am," he said. "You doing all right out here?" Naomi stopped, shading her eyes. "Fine, thank you. Just heading home." The passenger chuckled. "Home? Long way to walk in this heat, ain't it?" "I live right up on Clay Road," she answered evenly. "It's not far." The driver's gaze drifted to her belly. "You sure you should be out in the sun like that? Maybe let us give you a lift." It was not quite an offer. The way he said it, half command, half performance for the other man, made something in Naomi's stomach tighten. She kept her voice level. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine walking." The passenger leaned across, resting his arm on the window. "You a nurse from the hospital, right? We see you around." "Yes." He nodded toward her badge clipped to her collar. "You folks work all kinds of hours. Heard that place is a mess." Naomi didn't answer. The heat was thick enough to taste. Sweat ran down her spine. She wanted to keep walking, to end this small theater of power, but something in their faces told her not to turn her back. The driver twisted the cap off a bottle of water, drank half, and let the rest pour slowly over his hand. The water splashed onto the pavement, hissing as it met the hot tar. "Sure you don't want a little of this?" he asked. "I'm fine," she repeated. The passenger laughed. "Man, she's tough." The cruiser idled beside her for another heartbeat, then rolled forward a few feet. She thought they were leaving. Instead, the driver hit the brakes, reversed until they were beside her again, and with a careless flick of his wrist sent a stream of water arcing through the open window. It hit her shoulder and chest, cold and shocking. The laughter that followed was thin and bright against the hum of cicadas. For an instant, Naomi couldn't move. The water ran down her uniform, darkening the fabric, pooling under the curve of her belly. She looked at them, not pleading, not angry, simply stunned by the smallness of it. "Now you got some relief," the passenger said. "Don't say we never helped." They drove off slowly, still laughing. The taillights flared red and disappeared around the bend toward the courthouse. Naomi stood in the road, the bottle she'd bought slipping from her hand and rolling into the gutter. The humiliation was a physical thing pressing against her ribs. She felt the baby move, one sharp kick that reminded her she had to keep breathing. She drew a long breath, tasted salt and heat, and began to walk again. Her clothes clung to her skin. Each step sent a dull ache through her hips. The world had narrowed to the rhythm of footfalls and heartbeat. By the time she reached the small wooden bridge that crossed Miller's Creek, the dizziness had begun. Spots danced at the edge of her vision. She sat on the railing, trying to steady herself, but the sun was a hammer overhead. Cars passed. No one slowed. Somewhere a dog barked. Her pulse roared in her ears. She thought of Caleb, the steadiness of his hands when he tied his boots, the way he always kissed her forehead before leaving for patrol, promising quietly, "I'll come back." She whispered his name now. A prayer more than a call. The ground tilted. She tried to rise, failed. The last thing she saw was the glint of sunlight on her fallen water bottle and the distorted reflection of the sky and the puddle beside it. Then everything went white. When Naomi opened her eyes again, the world was sound before sight. Sirens, voices, the quick, clipped language of paramedics. Someone's hands were on her shoulders, rolling her gently onto her back.
"Ma'am, can you hear me?"
a man said. She tried to nod. The smell of antiseptic and sweat mixed in the air. Her vision cleared in bursts. The blue of a uniform, the flash of an ambulance's strobe, faces leaning over her, pulse dropping. Get her on the stretcher. She's pregnant. "Careful!" The straps tightened around her arms. Above her the sky wheeled, impossibly bright. She caught a glimpse of the road, of the dark patch where water had dried into nothing. A woman's voice. Urgent. Name's Naomi Cooper, nurse at County General. Another voice, male, sharp with realization. "Wait. Cooper? She's the sheriff's wife." The words fell through the heat like stones into a still pond. The movement around her quickened. Someone radioed ahead. Tires screeched. The door slammed. Cool air from the ambulance vents washed over her face. Inside that narrow space, she drifted between waking and the edge of sleep. Images came and went. Caleb's face, a badge glinting, the curve of his smile the day he learned he'd be a father. She wanted to tell him she was all right, that the baby was fine, that this would pass like everything else they'd endured. But the world slipped sideways, sound thinning to a single high note. Then, mercifully, darkness. Far across town, Sheriff Caleb Young sat in his office, reviewing paperwork that never seemed to end. The air conditioning hummed. The blinds carved pale stripes across the desk. He had just reached for his coffee when the dispatch line rang. The deputy's voice on the other end was too careful. "Sheriff, we've got an incident on Route 19. Female collapsed. Heat stroke, maybe assault." Name came back as Naomi Cooper. Caleb's cup tipped, spilling coffee across the papers. For a second, he couldn't speak. Then quietly, "Repeat that." "Naomi Cooper, sir. They're bringing her to County General now." The office seemed to contract around him. The hum of the air conditioner became a roar. He stood, chair scraping against the floor. "I'm on my way," he said, and the words were steel. As he stepped into the sunlight, the heat hit him full in the face, the same relentless sun that had followed Naomi all morning. Somewhere, the faint wail of an ambulance cut through the air, and the sheriff began to run. They told themselves stories about small things to make the hours pass. In the patrol cruiser, with the fan whining faintly above and the old police radio crackling like an animal, Lieutenant Wyatt Torres and Officer Carter Martinez exchanged the kind of banter that is part ritual, part relief. a shove of humor into the space where seriousness might otherwise settle. It was a discipline as much as a habit, to laugh at the day and thereby unburden the night. Wyatt, whose shoulders were broad enough to look as if they bore a physical weight even when they did not, liked to keep the air light. He had been on the force long enough to know how to make a face do the work of a mood. Carter, younger, more taut around the mouth, laughed easily at Wyatt's jokes. He liked the sound of his own mirth. Between them, the cruiser hummed through Mason County with the languid authority of a machine that had been built to occupy space and make others adjust around it. "That heat'll test a man's patience," Carter said, rolling down his window and letting the scorching air pour through the cab. He tipped his head back and wiped a hand across his upper lip. The sun made his forehead shine like the hood of the car. "Patient or not, you gotta keep alert. Folks do stupid things in this weather." Wyatt grinned and pretended to scold. "Stupid is practically an occupational hazard around here. There was that fella last summer who stood in the creek trying to argue fish out of a hole." He laughed at his own memory, a short, confident sound. Then his eyes fell to the vacant road ahead, and something like a practical hunger settled into his expression.
We pass County General every shift."
"Those nurses work like saints." Carter followed his gaze. "Yeah, long hours, short pay." He shifted in his seat, the movement a small, restless rhythm. "You ever get the feeling some folks think they're above needing a ride?" His lips lifted in imitation of a smug posture, and Wyatt played along with the mock indignation of it. They were both paying enough attention to the road to notice Naomi as she came into view, a figure moving with the careful gait of someone paced by fatigue and purpose. He saw the shape of her. Scrubs, a badge catching the sun, a hand cradling something beneath her shirt, and the casual recognition that came with seeing a familiar face. "Hey, that's the nurse from the ward," he observed. "Used to pick up donuts at the station every Monday." "She's got a ways to go," Carter said, polite in the way that is also a way of deciding how the rest of the encounter will be scripted. "Ain't nothing wrong with offering a lift." Wyatt had the kind of authority that tends to be quiet until it is exercised. He tapped the radio, signaled, and let the cruiser roll alongside the shoulder. The engine sound rose, a small statement of presence. There was nothing official in the motion. It could have been mistaken for neighborliness, except that neighborhood offers and authority are not the same thing. From the passenger seat, Carter leaned across and called out in the practiced, friendly tone officers keep for strangers. "Morning, ma'am. You doing all right out here in this heat?" Naomi's answer was even, practiced, small talk that fits the shape of a person who is used to saying enough. "Fine, thanks. Just heading home." The way she said it carried a kind of factual dignity. It would have been easy to let the matter remain as it was. Two drivers passing each other on a road, the small multiplicity of lives continuing without collision. But in the quiet lull between one moment and the next, power sometimes reaches out to touch a life because it can. For Wyatt, there was a pleasure in that proximity. For Carter, there was the companionship of not being the only one to enjoy the sensation of advantage. "You sure you ought to be walking in this?" Wyatt called out, and the tone contained both concern and the casual command of someone who likes to propose an action and see others comply. "We can give you a lift up to Clay Road." Naomi didn't answer right away. That pause came from the space where good manners and self-possession meet the instinct of self-protection. She declined with the calm, quiet firmness of someone who had rehearsed such refusals. "I appreciate it, but I'm fine walking." It was the kind of refusal they'd heard 1,000 times, polite and bordering on civil. For some, the refusal stops the exchange. For others, it is an opening, a cue to escalate the script into something more performative. That afternoon, the cruiser's air filled with a small, conspiratorial enthusiasm, like a theater awaiting applause. Wyatt felt the nudge that is almost institutional, a permission that comes from visible authority coupled with a willingness to take liberties and call it civic concern. He twisted the top off a water bottle and drank half, then tipped the remainder across his hand and let it spill onto the pavement. The motion was casual, dismissive, an emblem. "See what we offer, but in the way that keeps you reminded of your place." "Now you got some relief," Carter said, more a sentence of showmanship than assistance. He laughed then, a clean, bright sound not born of cruelty so much as the fact of company. The sound made the interior of the cruiser warm with a shared complicity. Wyatt nudged the wheel, reversed the car a little, and then, in a move that must have looked to them like a practical jape, reached out and sent the remaining arc of water through the open window. The stream flew through air and struck Naomi across the chest. It hit with the clarity of a small, intentional humiliation. When the water hit, it did something they had not intended to measure. It collapsed the idea of a joke into a physical reality. Naomi's clothes darkened where the cold traced across cotton. For a second she stood frozen, eyes wide, the sun catching the water as it skated down the fabric and pooled beneath the curve of her belly. The glare of the day showed every surface in glistening relief. There was a silence, the pause between an action and the human response to it. Then the cruiser's engine came alive again and they drove off, the laughter folding into the exhaust. In the clean logic of the cruiser, they told themselves the interview had been over, an awkward but necessary human interaction. They would file the memory away under odd moments, and it would sit there until bored tongues drew it out at the station to perform again. Carter cocked his head back, pleased with the echo of his own voice. Wyatt put the cruiser into gear with an ease that suggested a job already done, yet the scene left behind a residue. The old ways of occupying public space had the same swift speed as any physical thing thrown. It left marks. The first mark was a human face, Naomi's, that registered humiliation like an animal marks a wound. She took in the smallness of the offense, the publicness of it, and somehow managed to translate it into precise endurance. She began to walk again, each step a quiet insistence. The water on her scrubs dried into darker patches, telling the simple tale of what had happened. The story that grew among the men in the cruiser was not about harm, but about taste. It was just a water thing, Carter said, removing the edge from his own memory as if trimming a photograph. He mixed contrition into jest, which is often how one buries unease. She looked like she could use a laugh. Wyatt nodded. In the world they owned in that moment, commands disguised as kindness absolved them. The darker corners of the precinct's culture, where rough language and rougher deeds are learned and normalized, tend to flatten nuance. The men who police small towns sometimes mistake familiarity for warmth. Sometimes they mistake their own shadow for the whole of the world. They did not think, in those moments, of the body they had ached into by disregarding another's dignity. They did not think of the child beneath the cloth, of the gentle architecture of pregnancy and breath. They did not think of the way heat and humiliation can add themselves into a fragile body's tally until the sum becomes danger. They were, for that morning, in the economy of small amusements. The world beyond the cruiser's dashboard had been simplified into a sequence of good and bad, ally and oddity, and so the harm was small enough to be shrugged away. At the station later, the two of them would tell 1,000 versions of the same little performance, changing the angle to suit the audience. To partners who had not been there, it was funny. To supervisors, it was harmless easygoingness. To the radio, it would become a nothing, a laughable aside. No one in the cruiser asked whether Naomi had felt threatened, because in the culture that shaped them, the possibility that officers might inflict fear as pain had been compressed into the unlikely category of accidental. Those smaller moral measures, compassion, restraint, the habit of reading power as a duty rather than an entitlement, had been eroded the way river stone is smoothed under persistent current. Still, the day remembers differently from men. In the hours afterward, when the site of a cruelty has been recorded by a single handheld phone left in the corner of a slow-rolling crowd, the account that others tell does not care for the ease with which power tells a story. A gut-level video shows a reality without the soft filters of excuse. The people who live in the small county know which faces carry badges and which faces get wet and step away. In those streets, rumors do not die easily. As they rode on, the cruiser's radio crackled with the mundane calls of duty. An overturned fence, a report of livestock in a ditch, small emergencies that required legs and pragmatism rather than moral contemplation. Carter hummed an old tune under his breath, as if to smooth over the present with something remembered. Wyatt fumbled at his phone, checking a text that was about making the evening plans easier, choosing which bar would give the two of them a cheap round. It was only later, when the world had turned and the routine of the day pressed forward like a drumbeat, that a different sound entered the precinct. A pager, a dispatch call with the tenor of something more urgent. A woman had been found collapsed near Miller's Creek. They thought first of dehydration. Names moved across the radio like pieces on a board. Someone said Naomi Cooper. Someone else repeated it with the new inflection, sheriff's wife. That phrase, sheriff's wife, moved through the station like a bell. It made men straighten because it names, in one quick syllable, the place where private and public intersect. It made Wyatt and Carter look at each other as if the morning's small triumph had become a matter with consequences painted in a different color. The laughter that earlier had seemed easy evaporated from their faces like cold water in a sun. It is an odd thing with shared habit. What is joked about in a moment can become the seed of fear in another. The patrolmen exchanged glances now that were thin with calculation. They had been on the wrong side of an unspoken boundary. They had performed a humiliation for themselves that might, by the evening, ripple wider than they'd expected. Wyatt forced a slow breath outward, a motion that was meant to be steadying. He did not yet understand that the night would not only collect his story, but that of a place where power will be measured, and measured again, by whether the men who enforce it will answer for their small cruelties. He had not yet been called to a room where a sheriff's steady gaze might be aimed not only for answers, but for a reckoning. Until then, the two men continued the round, the cruiser eating up miles, the radio reciting the county's small emergencies. The morning's brightness folded into noon. Someone at the station made coffee. Someone else set about paperwork. The world turned, indifferent and exacting, and the two officers returned to the tasks that would, for a little while, allow them to believe they inhabited a place in which small offenses were just that, small. But Mason County's streets have a particular way of remembering. The sun that had lit their laughter would later throw a different light across the same road, one that showed water where it had clung to fabric, the swollen curve of a body, the blur of ambulance lights. The same sun revealed that every action has a measure, and when actions are backed by the authority of uniform, the measure grows larger than a joke. By the time they learned Naomi had been taken by ambulance, Wyatt and Carter were walking toward the roll call room, and there was a new, hush-like gravity in the air. It was as if the precinct itself took a breath, an institution sensing that the simplest thing it tolerates can sometimes become the thing that asks for the most exacting answer. The story would not stop at a bottle's arc. It never does. As they rode on, the cruiser's radio crackled with the mundane calls of duty, an overturned fence, a report of livestock in a ditch, small emergencies that required legs and pragmatism rather than moral contemplation. Carter hummed an old tune under his breath, as if to smooth over the present with something remembered. Wyatt fumbled at his phone, checking a text that was about making the evening plans easier, choosing which bar would give the two of them a cheap round. It was only later, when the world had turned and the routine of the day pressed forward like a drumbeat, that a different sound entered the precinct. A pager, a dispatch call with the tenor of something more urgent. A woman had been found collapsed near Miller's Creek. They thought first of dehydration. Names moved across the radio like pieces on a board. Someone said Naomi Cooper. Someone else repeated it with the new inflection, sheriff's wife. That phrase, sheriff's wife, moved through the station like a bell. It made men straighten because it names, in one quick syllable, the place where private and public intersect. It made Wyatt and Carter look at each other as if the morning's small triumph had become a matter with consequences painted in a different color. The laughter that earlier had seemed easy evaporated from their faces like cold water in a sun. It is an odd thing with shared habit. What is joked about in a moment can become the seed of fear in another. The patrolmen exchanged glances now that were thin with calculation. They had been on the wrong side of an unspoken boundary. They had performed a humiliation for themselves that might, by the evening, ripple wider than they'd expected. Wyatt forced a slow breath outward, a motion that was meant to be steadying. He did not yet understand that the night would not only collect his story, but that of a place where power will be measured, and measured again, by whether the men who enforce it will answer for their small cruelties. He had not yet been called to a room where a sheriff's steady gaze might be aimed not only for answers, but for a reckoning. Until then, the two men continued the round, the cruiser eating up miles, the radio reciting the county's small emergencies. The morning's brightness folded into noon. Someone at the station made coffee. Someone else set about paperwork. The world turned, indifferent and exacting, and the two officers returned to the tasks that would, for a little while, allow them to believe they inhabited a place in which small offenses were just that, small. But Mason County's streets have a particular way of remembering. The sun that had lit their laughter would later throw a different light across the same road, one that showed water where it had clung to fabric, the swollen curve of a body, the blur of ambulance lights. The same sun revealed that every action has a measure, and when actions are backed by the authority of uniform, the measure grows larger than a joke. By the time they learned Naomi had been taken by ambulance, Wyatt and Carter were walking toward the roll call room, and there was a new, hush-like gravity in the air. It was as if the precinct itself took a breath, an institution sensing that the simplest thing it tolerates can sometimes become the thing that asks for the most exacting answer. The story would not stop at a bottle's arc. It never does. She tried to call out, to say words that would name what hurt, to tell them that she felt small and frightened. But the sound that left her mouth was not language, but the dry wind of a throat closing. The air seemed heavy, as if full of static. Her knees gave. She sunk down onto the planked walk of the bridge, feeling the splintered wood press into the back of her thighs. A sudden tightness wrapped around her ribs, a spasm that took breath hostage. Panic, quick and elemental, flared like a match briefly struck. For a swift and terrifying instant, she thought the worst, of losing herself and the baby together in a county road where no one would remember names. And then someone's hands were beneath her back. They steadied her. The voice from a pickup was closer now. An elderly man bending, concern carving his face. Ma'am, can you hold on?" he asked. The words were practical and small, and for a moment they were all that stood between her and nothingness. She reached with her free hand and gripped the railing and the man's sleeve and held them both as if faith were a rope. A group gathered slowly, hesitantly, like people approaching a strange animal. A young woman pressed a handkerchief to Naomi's lips. A teenage boy fumbled for his phone and fumbled with the emergency number. The world resumed its business around them, and yet the bridge had become a small island of urgent attention. Naomi's breath came in surges, shallow but measured, like the rhythm of a monitor she had seen in hospital corridors. The baby moved again, this time a soft, audible fluttering, and the movement filled Naomi with a fierce, inchoate courage to keep breathing, to anchor herself. By the time the ambulance's lights painted the fields blue and red, Naomi's sense of humiliation had folded into something else entirely, a tender, protective anger that did not need to be loud to be true. She caught sight of the cruiser that had driven off earlier, parked now discreetly a little way down the road with its men standing like a pair of statues. They watched not like priests of contrition, but like men measuring the fallout of a joke. One of them, Carter, ran a hand over his mouth as if to smooth out the lines of something that no longer felt uncomplicated. Wyatt's face had an odd, thin expression, as if the morning's casual claim to power had been subjected to a new appraisal. There are consequences the body registers before the mind arrives at them. A flinch from the sight of a uniform, a tightening of the stomach at a remembered word. Naomi, in those moments, felt the country of that consequence in the hollow under her ribs. That hollow would have to be named later, by doctors, by lawyers, by a town whose memory had begun to stir. But for now, the immediate thing was simple. She had to be tended, and someone had to make sure the child inside her was kept from harm. As the paramedics lifted her with practiced hands, bundling her carefully onto a stretcher, Naomi's eyes found the pickup driver, old Mr. Harlow, who squeezed her fingers and gave the smallest of nods. It was the kind of affirmation that costs nothing and means everything, an acknowledgement that a human being, even when made small as an act of amusement, is not to be left in a road to suffer. When the ambulance's doors closed and the vehicle began to move, Naomi watched the town blur past in a smear of sun and barn and billboard. In the small hollow where her hand had rested, the baby continued to move, as if insisting on the stubbornness of life. She closed her eyes with a resolve that was at once an acceptance and a vow. Whatever the morning had done, whatever the two men had meant by their laughter, she would not allow that moment to determine the child's fate, nor to make her own heart forget how to ask for dignity. On the radio, someone called for traffic to be held. The cruiser rolled away a few moments later. Somewhere ahead, a siren wailed the way a city makes its alarm known. For Naomi, whose senses had been triaged by pain and sweat and the thin white light of humiliation, that whistle sounded like both a threat and a promise, an odd, wheeling emblem that the day would not end with a single small cruelty. The county's story was beginning to turn in a direction none of them had expected. The ambulance moved like a sudden seam through the waking town, blue and red lights sewing a ribbon of urgency across sun-struck asphalt. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and adrenaline, of cold plastic and rubber, and Naomi Cooper lay on, the stretcher with the universe reduced to small sounds, the hiss of the oxygen mask, the careful rustle of paramedic gloves, the patient cadence of a monitor counting heartbeats. Her cheek was cool against the stretcher's pad. Rain from the morning's humiliation had become the salt of sweat and the chill of fever. Every breath felt like an act of negotiation with the world, pulse weak but present. The woman beside her said, voice low and professional, a tide of competence that kept panic from sweeping over the narrow cabin. Her hands were sure. She checked Naomi's blood pressure and adjusted the oxygen mask with a tenderness that was all form and function. "We've got an IV in. I want a full vital set on arrival. Possible heat exhaustion complicated by pregnancy. Notify County General Obstetrics." Naomi's fingers fumbled at the coarse fabric of the stretcher's edge. The movement was clumsy, disconnected from the rest of her body. For a moment she did not know whether she was floating above the scene or submerged within it. Faces tilted down, framed by the blinking lights. Voices became the weather, overhead, drifting, meaningful. She heard the paramedic say her name. She heard the faint echo of someone calling out numbers like a prayer. Inside her, the baby kicked. Light, insistent. The motion was a small, private affirmation in the midst of clinical hands and radio chatter. Naomi clung to that movement like a covenant. She wanted to tell them that the child was fine, that the flutters meant life and defiance, that the world could not take the small thing she carried, but words were thin threads in the face of the ambulance's motion and the microphone's clipped announcements to the hospital. Outside the van, the county blurred past in ordered snapshots. A mailbox she had passed that morning, the bent sign for Miller's Creek, the low brick of the school. The sun angled the windows into a glint that made the world look like a photograph someone had left in the sun too long. The vehicle's suspension rattled over small rises. Every bump translated into a small jolt inside Naomi's chest, and under the newness of pain that had lodged there. On the radio, the dispatcher's voice ordered clearance. "County General Trauma Room 3 ready. ETA 5 minutes." The paramedic repeated the ETA and took one more manual reading from Naomi's arm. The number rose and fell like waves. The medics murmured instruction to one another, a private lexicon of urgent protocol. Fetal monitoring. On arrival, OB on standby. Code. No code. Maintain airway. Prepare for possible delivery if necessary. Each syllable carried a weight that Naomi could feel like a pressure against her ribs. She drifted in and out of attention. Images punched through the gray. The pickup driver's hand on hers earlier. Mr. Harlow's face bent in concern. The cruiser's taillights receding like evidence of an old world. Then, as if pulled suddenly to shore, Naomi's mind shaped a name. Caleb. She wanted him near the way a fever wants a cool cloth. More than that, she wanted to know his steady hand, his rough palm pressing gently to her forehead, to feel the small ceremony of his presence that made the impossible feel endured. Her lips moved, forming his name like a benediction. The voice came to life in another part of town. Sheriff Caleb Young sat behind his desk, the station's fluorescent light cutting the office into strips of brightness and shadow. He had been arguing with budgets and vendors earlier, small clerical battles that were the mundane armor beneath public duty, and had subsided into a slow pre-lunch fatigue when the dispatch radio clicked sharply against the silence. He picked up the handset with the muscle memory of a man who lived by signals and timing, who measured his day in pages of reports and the cadence of his deputies' voices. "Dispatch," he said, voice flat, professional. "Sheriff, we have a female down on Route 19. Possible heat-related collapse. Name given as Naomi Cooper. Ambulance en route to County General." The deputy's tone was clipped, careful, as if stepping around the possibility that this might be routine, until it was not. For a moment, the word Naomi hung in the room like a scent. The sheriff's hand closed on the receiver so tightly his knuckles blanched. The paper cup of coffee at his elbow tipped, splashing a dark arc across the paperwork. There was an interval in which the office was no longer simply a room but a theater in which time paused to test him. He rose without thinking, feet finding the worn groove of the supervisor's chair and the air felt suddenly thinner. "Stay on it," he said. "Notify me when she's en route or if anything changes." The voice that left his mouth was a careful instrument. If fury lived inside him, it was calibrated. It did not yet have shape. He could feel the electric tension of fatherhood and husbandhood tingling under the skin, an accusation not of the world but of its small cruelties. He gathered his keys. "I'm coming in." As the ambulance threaded its way closer, Naomi's awareness fluttered between concrete detail and internal impression. The medic spoke about heat stroke, about dehydration compounded by the demands of pregnancy, how an expectant body's fluid balance can tip with alarming speed when the balance of rest and exertion is upset. In the back of the ambulance, every precaution was taken as if their hands could fold time enough to correct an error the road had made. A paramedic brushed the hair from Naomi's forehead and murmured, "You're going to be okay. Listen to my voice. Keep steady." The words were not a certainty so much as a practice, a deliberate recitation to anchor the patient and the crew alike. Naomi tried to comply. She imagined the hospital's white linen, the quiet confidence of nurses who had seen worse and had found their way through. It was a small faith, threaded from memory. Outside, County General's parking lot yawned like an amphitheater for the next act. The ambulance swung into an emergency bay where technicians and nurses were already waiting, a choreography practiced until it was nearly muscle memory. The doors opened, flood of brisk air and fluorescent promise met them, and the stretcher slid out on practiced rails. Nurses took the patient with two hands as if she were fragile porcelain. Naomi's world condensed into the ceiling tiles passing. Overhead and the way the light refracted off the mask on her face. There, as a team moved around her with the precise calm of practiced urgency, a nurse in charge glanced at the paperwork the paramedic handed over and then looked up with a small intentional motion of recognition. "Naomi Cooper?" she said, tilting her head. "Sheriff's wife?" Someone else, an orderly, called the obstetrics team on the internal line. A messenger ran to the elevators with a speed that felt like the hospital's breath having been taken all at once. The name, when said aloud, carried weight behind it, an extra layer of consequence. The staff shifted into a different register. Their manner remained professional, but the undercurrent rippled with the knowledge that what they were about to face would involve not only a patient on the gurney, but also the complexities of public life. Caleb's drive from the station to County General blurred into a montage of green lights and honking cars. His cruiser devoured the miles with a decisiveness that matched the tight coil of his jaw. He had not been told the full particulars. There had been little time for dispatch to gather details. But the phrase "sheriff's wife" crackled like a wire in his ear. He saw, with the spare imagination of a man trained to anticipate outcomes, the small tableau. Naomi bent with fatigue, the child stubbornly alive in the darkness inside her, and the thin, dangerous space between endurance and collapse. He cut through traffic with the precise, lawful authority of his office, his siren a low wail that arced through neighborhoods. Drivers pulled aside with the practiced courtesy of a town where a badge still meant immediate deference. His hands rested at 10 and 2 on the wheel, the motion a practiced choreography. He did not think in melodramatic terms. In shelter and demand he assessed, catalogued. He rehearsed his entrance like a man who knew that every movement would be watched and weighed. At the emergency bay, the procession happened with an economy of movement that felt ritualized. A nurse greeted him by the trauma room door and motioned him through. When Caleb stepped into the bright, strategy-lit space, Naomi lay surrounded by staff, her face pale under the halogen glow. Her eyes opened and found him, and for a suspended, private moment the office and rank and protocol fell away. She reached for him as if the word sheriff had been only a placeholder for the thing she most needed. A steady hand. He leaned down, his gloved fingers folding around hers, grounding into a tenderness that was unshowy and fierce. "Naomi," he said, and his voice, though low, contained an urgency that made staff reorient. The name was not said for form. It echoed the small covenant between two people who had promised, in the ordinary ways of married life, to hold each other. He read the monitors, listened to the staff succinctly deliver their findings. Dehydration, possible heat stroke, but fetal heart tones present, albeit tachycardic. Then he turned back to her and lowered his voice. "You're here," he said, and with a simple fact he began to stitch the loose edges of panic into something manageable. "You're here. They're taking good care. Tell me what you remember." Naomi's mouth worked, the muscles forming speech like a reluctant bird testing a cold sky.
"Wrote her."
They laughed, she whispered, each word a fragile thing. The sentence was small, but it carried the day's cruelty inside it. A dark bead threaded into blue hospital light. She sucked in a breath as a nurse adjusted her IV. "I kicked," she added, a thin smile flaring and gone. Caleb's glance sharpened, a blade of concern folding into a measured command. He suppressed the immediate impulse, anger, the animal response, because rage has a way of obscuring careful action. He spoke to the attending physician in quiet but precise terms. "Order a full OB panel, keep her for observation, set up fetal monitoring, prep for possible emergent intervention if signs deteriorate." He asked the physician about fluid balance, the electrolyte corrections needed, the rate at which an expectant mother's body recovers from an insult. The doctor, steady and competent, answered in the language of practice. "Infusion, monitoring, check for contractions, but not yet. Everything to be measured closely." In a corner, the room's staff moved with the grave, efficient economy of those used to managing crises. Machines hummed. The fetal monitor sprouted its thin line, charting a tiny heart. Naomi's gaze kept finding Caleb. There was trust in that look, but also an undercurrent of something harder to name, an uneasiness born of violation, a private accounting that would not be satisfied by stitches and IVs alone. Caleb stayed by her side. He did not call for retribution yet. That would come later, with procedures and internal hearings and the slow grind of institutional accountability. For now, his primary duty was to the woman on the gurney and the life inside her. He held her hand in the steady way a man might hold a fragile bowl, careful not to press too hard but not willing to let go. Outside the bay's glass doors, the town kept turning. The cruiser that had been responsible for the cruelty sat for the moment a distance away by the curb. Men moved between the precinct and the hospital like shadows, and questions would follow, ordered and legal. The sheriff, who knew the weight of law as both instrument and obligation, prepared himself to ask hard questions in the manner his office demanded. He understood the danger. It was not only the act itself, but the precedent the town would set in how it responded. But none of that came before the intimacy of the room's small dramas. The thin sound of a monitor, the blur of a nurse checking a drip, the patient's labored breathing eased by a doctor's practiced touch. Caleb bent his head, placing the side of his forehead gently against Naomi's brow. The contact was a simple human economy, more potent than any declaration of office could be in that moment. "You'll be all right," he said. It was not a promise he could make absolutely, but it was one he would keep by acting with deliberation. As he spoke, a small, stubborn sound entered the room, the fetal monitor's steady pulse line, and the movement of life, persistent and ordinary, reminded everyone of what truly mattered. He stood then, briefly to give the doctor the space to report tests, to hear orders, to make his demands of procedure. The sheriff's voice was both husband and official. He asked for privacy for Naomi's care, for expedited lab results, for the hospital to be blunt if the child's condition worsened. The medical team complied with the unforced efficiency of professionals who must do the job regardless of names. Far beyond the windows that framed the emergency bay, Mason County hummed like a living thing, small shops, porches, the courthouse where civic rituals unfolded. The day's earlier cruelty had bent the arc of the morning into a new trajectory. What had been a brief, ugly incident on the roadside had become a matter that would test the town's character. Inside the hospital, under the bright, impartial light, the personal and the civic met quietly in the hands that kept watch. Naomi drifted again toward sleep, her breathing smoothing under the oxygen and the cool embrace of attentive care. Caleb sat in the plastic chair at her bedside, fingers still entwined with hers. In that private plot of time, his jaw unclenched and the rawness in his chest found a kind of disciplined focus. He would have to be sheriff and husband both, and those duties he knew were not always consonant. For now, the ordering of priorities was simple and human. "Rest now," he told her. "I'll be here. I'll be here when you wake." Her eyelids fluttered closed. The fetal monitor sang its steady hymn. Out in the hospital corridor, life continued, patient and unblinking. An ordered motion that would soon be called upon to witness what the town would decide to remember. For Naomi and Caleb, the sequence of minutes that lay ahead was about care, then recovery. After that, choices would be made and consequences met. But in the narrow, bright room, the metrics of medicine and love held together in a fragile, luminous weave. The precinct was a low building whose heart beat in fluorescent tubes and the rustle of paper. Its walls were the color of office toner. Its linoleum had a shine earned by decades of shoe leather. Around the roll call board, badges were thumbtacked like small medals of attention. Names and shifts arranged themselves on the calendar as if the very act of writing could contain the unpredictability of the road. On a day like any other, the station would be the kind of place where coffee cooled in chipped mugs and gossip braided itself into the rhythm of duty. On the morning Naomi Cooper's name reached its ears, the station became something else, a room that sensed a storm before it struck, and braced. Deputies drifted in and out like figures in a theater of small obligations. Some carried the casual gravity of men and women who were paid to steady other people's tempers. Others arrived with the easy, undeserved relaxation of those who had learned to treat the job as muscle memory. Wyatt Torres and Carter Martinez moved with the same swagger they had worn on the road, their confidence a kind of habit. They passed through the bay with the air of men who know the county and imagine it will always, obligingly, return their gaze to them. At the center of the room, a dusty television hung from the ceiling, playing the morning traffic report in a loop. A whiteboard listed warrants and welfare checks. A younger deputy, new enough that his uniform still smelled of the supply room, sat at a desk and organized stapled reports the way a man sorts small collections of stones. For now, there was the hum of normalcy, the little rituals that render public life tolerable. And then the radio clicked. Dispatch called the shift in a voice that contained both routine and the tremor of something unassimilated. Names moved through the speaker like a current. A collapse on Route 19, an ambulance en route, County General on standby. The room's air shifted. It happened like that. A subtle acoustical change as attention gathered. At first, the replies were procedural. Acknowledgments, confirmations. Then someone in the back, who had an ear for names the way some people have an ear for music, repeated them slowly as if tasting each syllable. Naomi Cooper? He lifted his head. Sheriff's wife? The room's temperature dropped in a small, practical way, the way a courtroom hush settles when someone mentions an important name. Wyatt and Carter's banter shrank into smaller sounds. The swagger that had been comfortably bracing them now became a narrow thing against the possibilities the word conjured. Men straightened. Phones stilled. Somewhere in the precinct, a locker slammed as someone shifted a jacket, the sound sharp in the suspended air. The sheriff's office door opened with the soft creak of wood that had known many footsteps. A deputy poked his head in with the kind of deferential caution one uses when a sleeping dog is being roused. "Sheriff, we've got an update. Cooper, Naomi Cooper, was brought in. Heat-related collapse. She's stable for now, but being observed under OB." Caleb Young rose as if the motion were a gear in the clockwork of his life. He had been elbow-deep in budget statements and payroll spreadsheets an hour before. The everyday paper ordinariness of his duties had kept him anchored to the precinct's floor. Now he straightened like a man who has the sense that one small private event is about to be forced into the public ledger. He did not hurry, but he did not waste time. He moved with a sheriff's efficiency, each step measured, each motion exact. The deputies watched him. Men who had, at breakfast tables that morning, joked and elbowed one another, now folded the space between them politely. The presence of the sheriff had its own economy. Caleb's face was not a mask so much as the business of a man who had learned to put feeling into compartments. His jaw tightened not in rage but in focus. He walked to the radio, listened to the dispatch, gathered the facts in a slow, deliberate way that kept the impulse to leap from the surface. "No mention of an altercation?" he asked. A young woman at dispatch shook her head. "They said she collapsed, Sheriff. Some of the neighbors called it in. There was an EMT on scene who said possible heat exhaustion. Nothing else was made clear." Caleb inhaled as if to steady the small rising tide of his mind. He did not yet know if the incident at the roadside, the cracked joke, the arc of water, had been reported in any official capacity. He had not been present. He rarely was for the small things. That omission grated at him now, a private dissatisfaction about the business of oversight. If Naomi had been humiliated, it would not be the first time a woman's pride had been trivialized on a county road. But the difference lay in whose wife she was. The sheriff's wife was not a title to be wielded like a shield or a lance. It was a human tether that gave him a double duty: to act as an officer of the law and as a husband who would not let a wrong go unexamined. He turned then, and the small movements of the room became more than ritual. "Notify County General I'm en route," he said. "Make sure Livings and Grant, deputies Livings and Grant, are assigned to secure the scene on Route 19. Pull the dash cams for Units 14 and 17. Those were our cruisers in that area this morning. I want statements from anyone who was on duty for the shift that passed them. No one leaves town without checking in." His voice was not raised, but it carried the authority of a man for whom decisions were the thing that kept chaos from the door. The instruction fell into the room with the solidity of a well-placed stone. Wyatt and Carter's faces did not blanch or go pale with fear. They simply went still, the way men do when someone changes the rules of a game without making a show of it. Wyatt, still wearing some residue of the morning's bravado, tried to meet Caleb's eye with a grin that did not reach the corners. "Sheriff, that's standard procedure," Caleb interrupted, not with fury, but with a kind of gravity that suggested he had in mind more than the moment. He wasn't scolding. He was organizing the terms of accountability. If there was a complaint, we deal with it through the chain. If there wasn't, we still gather footage. We'll be transparent. His voice kept the shape of fairness. Transparency, Caleb believed, had more power than theatrical punishment. It made for the kind of justice that could be explained in the light of day. The words landed in the room with a subtle insistence. If Wyatt and Carter had hoped the morning's episode would be a forgotten transgression, folded into laughter between shifts, the sheriff's presence suggested a different possibility: that the small thing might be measured in full and made part of a public inventory. Deputies took notes. A senior sergeant tabled his clipboard. A policy manual lay like a ready map. A deputy cleared his throat. "Sheriff, if there's something we can do right now—" "We secure footage," Caleb replied. "We speak to witnesses. We give Naomi privacy and care. We do not discuss this in public. And we will make sure County General has what they need. That is the department's duty and yours as deputies. Any deviation and you will answer for it." There was a murmur of assent, the kind that is less about heartfelt agreement than procedural recognition. The deputy who had suggested action nodded, feeling the pleasant weight of having been given something practical to do. Men moved to the phones or to their assigned tasks, the immediate choreography of an institution resuming order. And yet, underneath the official motions, a current flowed. Men leaned toward one another in corners and whispered in small cohorts. Rumors have their own appetite, and the precinct is a place where rumor is a kind of currency traded daily. The spicy retelling of the morning's event. Who said what? Who laughed? Which man had poured the water already gathered detail with the same rapidity of a rumor gaining weight when passed mouth to ear. Carter lingered by his locker, eyes darting as if measuring whether the sheriff's orders would land like paper on his desk or like something heavier. Wyatt fidgeted with the bolt of his belt as if the next movement required rehearsal. Both men were capable, competent at the truest core of their job, and they had a camaraderie that allowed them to believe small cruelties were blithely forgivable. But the sheriff's arrival meant something else. It suggested that the county's narrative might be reoriented not by private jokes but by policy and public record. Caleb moved among them with the unassuming air of a man who preferred the machinery of his office to the theater of punishment. He did not need to mete out immediate scorn. He wanted facts. "I expect full cooperation," he told them again, softer this time. "We answer to the law and to the people, and we don't let our young become reckless in the cost." A young deputy raised a hand, hesitant. "Sheriff, there's—" Body cam from the cruiser that rounded the bend near Miller's Creek. It's been uploaded by a bystander to a social media feed. It's getting traction. The mention of social media widened the precinct into something larger than its walls. Voices rose and fell. Tablets and phones were turned toward faces like so many small windows onto an expanding problem. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for the first time since he'd entered the room, a small shadow crossed his features. The public sphere had already begun its work. Before the department could organize itself into the polity of paperwork, the county's many eyes had begun to record, to amplify, to judge. He asked for the link. He watched the footage, first as an officer, then as a husband. The clip was small, handheld, sunlight slanting across the screen. It showed Naomi at the roadside. Then the cruiser pulling close. A splash of water and a pair of men laughing. The camera wavered with the jitter of an amateur recording, but the content was clear, small, indisputable evidence of humiliation. Caleb's shoulders moved in a calculation that covered the private and the public. He closed the laptop gently as if the device might hold more than it ought. We will handle this, he said. We will answer publicly and act administratively. We will not let rumor become substitute for process. We will also make sure Naomi has privacy and that the family is protected from intrusion. There was something in his tone that suggested he had chosen his battle lines. He was not ready to use his badge as a blunt instrument of vengeance, nor would he allow the badge to be used as a shield by his own. He wanted the department's integrity placed at the center. A clear investigation, the preservation of evidence, the protection of the victim and family. In a room where 100 small judgments were made daily, he sought a larger, steadier moral measure. As deputies moved to their tasks, preparing to pull footage and take statements, a reporter from the local station, who had heard the whisper of movement and come to the precinct hoping for a statement, leaned against a counter with a small, polite smile. He did not at first seem predatory. His job simply required him to ask the questions the public would demand. Caleb met his eyes with the practiced politeness of a man who understands the shape of civic message. "We will release a statement," he said. "We are looking into the incident. We will not comment further until the facts are known." The reporter took the line and nodded, recording the words as if they were a capsule of assurance. Outside, a camera van idled, and the town held its breath in dozens of private living rooms where the clip had already been viewed. By the time the morning bled into noon, legal processes had been touched into motion. Deputies were assigned to the site. The internal affairs liaison drafted paperwork. The county's PR coordinator prepared a measured release. The machinery of a small town's justice, slow and sometimes clumsy, whirred into action. Yet even as the department organized, the human business of worry, of love, of shame, continued to move through the station like an undercurrent. Caleb sat at his desk for a long moment, the radio's reports sinking into him with the methodical gravity of a man who takes the weight of duty seriously. He found in the pause the shape of an oath that was at once public and private, to do right by his wife and to do right by the law he served. He rose then, stood and walked toward the side door that would take him to County General. Deputies watched him go with the respect habit lens. Wyatt and Carter, who had been the epicenter of morning mischief, followed the motions of their duty with a new, quieter cadence. The precinct took a breath and returned to its work, but the quiet that had fallen carried with it the sense that a reckoning had begun, not a matter of theater or rumor, but of the slow, necessary work of exposing what power can do in the small, private corners of a county road. Caleb Young moved through the hospital with the precise gait of a man who had spent half his life negotiating space between strangers and crises. The corridor lights turned into long, even bands above his head. The antiseptic tang of the air warned his senses awake in a way only institutions with constant suffering know how to do. Nurses glanced up as he passed, their expressions a measured mix of professional courtesy and the human curiosity that arrives when the public and private cross, when a badge is also the mark of a husband in a place designed to contain frailty. He found Naomi in a small room off the emergency bay, its walls painted a cool, forgetful blue that hospitals favor because it suggests calm. The scene was at once ordinary and peculiar. The hum of the fetal monitor, the whisper of a suction machine, the soft footfalls of clinical staff moving like a well-rehearsed chorus. Naomi lay propped on pillows, her hair damp at the temple where a nurse had smoothed it back. Her skin held the shadowed warmth of someone who had been drawn close to collapse and then drawn back, fragile as a moth's wing. When her eyes opened and found him, something immediate and private passed between them that had nothing to do with rank or the county's politics. There was no parade here, only the small honesty of two people who had pledged themselves to each other through ordinary mornings and sudden storms. Her hand searched, found his, and closed around it as if she could hold him in place by sheer grip. The gesture felt as old and as steady as vows. "Caleb," she whispered, a small word that carried a freight of fatigue and relief. "You're here," he answered, the words more prayer than report. His palm was large over hers, the knuckles calloused by years of work that had been both physical and moral. He did not let the office intrude on the intimacy of the moment. He allowed himself the simple, human response of a husband who has come at the sound of a name, and found the person he loves still present. The attending physician, a woman whose voice was the balance of competence and calm, offered the clinical report with the careful economy that hospitals demand. Dehydration, exacerbated by exertion and the heat, she said. We've given IV fluids, monitored fetal heart tones. They're present, though elevated. We'll keep her under observation for 24 hours. No signs of preterm labor at this time, but we'll continue to monitor. She folded her hands as she spoke, the professional finality of one who has seen many near misses and knows the difference between what is urgent and what is manageable. Caleb listened with the attention of one who needs to translate those sentences into plans. Relief shivered through him like light through glass. He asked a string of questions with the efficiency of someone trained to parse fact from fear. How much fluid? When did the contractions begin? Was there trauma? The doctor answered each in the same measured tone, and then, when the clinical pieces were placed, folded back toward the human. She's stable. She's tired. She'll need rest. He sat then, refusing to make a show of grief or fury. Fury, if it came, would have to be deliberate. It would have to be serviceable, organized toward results the county could accept. In the low, private field of the hospital room, he was content simply to be husband before anything else. He bent and pressed his forehead to Naomi's, a small gesture that accounted for the hours they spent in quiet together. The way she liked to have the window cracked, the soft ritual of coffee in chipped mugs, the way he had promised to be at every birth, every hard day. His presence was a sort of sanction that said without noise, I am here, and the world will bend around that fact. But even as he lingered in the small sanctuary of bedside, the other half of his life, sheriff, administrator, public man, stirred awake like a muscle being flexed. The video that had circulated through the county, the arc of water, the two men with their laughter, floated in the back of his mind like a stain on clear cloth. The hospital, with all its care, was also a place of witnesses. Reporters might knock at the door, neighbors might drift close, and the precinct, his precinct, would be expected to answer in the language of policy and procedure. He rose when the doctor left to attend another patient, a soft apology of duty on her lips, and pressed his hand again to Naomi's. I'll be right back, he promised. It was a vow with a double edge. He would not leave her, and yet he must move into a public role that required him to hold both intimacy and authority in the same breath. Outside the room, the hospital hummed its steady, unblinking tune. Nurses moved in practiced patterns, wishing their faces to remain neutral while their eyes kept a private ledger of small lives saved and small losses mourned. Caleb passed the observation desk where a clerk asked if he wanted the family room to be opened and a quieter corner to be arranged. He declined the offer with a curt nod. Privacy would come in time, but now the machinery of his office required him. He crossed the glass to the emergency corridor and stepped into a place where procedure and flesh intersected. The sheriff's return to the precinct had been only a prelude. The station was a short drive away, but the work it demanded would be immediate. Pull dashcam feeds, gather statements, assign deputies to protect Naomi's privacy from predatory eyes, and make a decision about how to proceed with internal review. For a man learned in law, there is a particular order that must be followed. Letting that order be seen to function was itself a kind of remedy. His cruiser moved through Mason County with something akin to the economy of someone moving with purpose. As he drove, he considered the choices that lay ahead and the ethical hazards each presented. There is a temptation when lines of power blur to act like a man scorned. There is an equal temptation to let that personal hurt be the fuel for public action. He would not let either impulse govern him. Justice, to his mind, required a tempered measure. Transparency without vengeance, authority without spectacle. Back at the precinct, deputies had already followed his orders. Screens were aglow with captured footage. A thin manila folder labeled Route 19 Incident sat on the sergeant's desk waiting for him like an accusation. He could feel the station's energy shift as soon as he entered, heads turning, the quiet pulsing of organized concern. He nodded curtly to the men and women at their stations. Their faces showed a mixture of obedience and apprehension. Some, like Wyatt and Carter, walked with that practiced ease that masked an internal tightening of nerves. Others approached him with the protocol of small, efficient movements, paperwork, assignments, timelines. He addressed the officers in the small briefing room where the whiteboard held notes on ongoing operations. His voice was even and practiced. "We will handle this transparently. Pull all footage from units near Route 19 for the time between 7:30 and 9:30 this morning. Locate any civilian footage. Interview witnesses. No one discusses this matter publicly until we issue a statement. Full cooperation." He met the eyes of the men involved, not to browbeat but to register the seriousness. "We are accountable to the law, first, and to the people. This office does not and will not tolerate degrading conduct by its members." It was, in many ways, the most straightforward order he could give. He dispensed tasks with the coolness that comes from habit. There would be internal affairs, there would be union representatives, there would be a slow, meticulous unspooling of the day's events. He watched the deputies move into motion like pieces in a practiced ballet. Some may have bristled, others may have been relieved to have orders to complete. For every man in that room he wanted facts, not theater. Even so, the office is a place of private allegiances. A few of the deputies lingered after his orders, seeking the sort of assurance a leader provides beyond directives. "Sheriff," one said quietly, "we don't want this turning into something that undermines the whole force." Caleb understood the anxiety. He also understood the necessity of separating institutional health from individual failing. "We'll be careful," he replied. "But careful does not mean we ignore harm. We will be accountable." He thought of Naomi again, the way she had pressed the palm of his hand, the small noises she had made, the look in her eyes. With a kind of grim tenderness, he promised himself that he would let procedure be the backbone of his response. Private vengeance would exact costs he did not wish to pay. Public justice would demand the discipline of the law. He would use his authority not to crush but to correct. That was the best reconciliation of his two obligations. He would ensure that those responsible were held to account. Yes, but he would also make sure the department emerged with its integrity intact. Later, when the press would gather and the town would choose sides, the sheriff would stand at a lectern and read a statement into a microphone. There would be phrases about transparency, about cooperation, about the primacy of due process. But for now there was simply the business of the moment. Naomi to protect, the child to monitor, evidence to secure, a department to steady. He stepped back into the hospital corridor with that list in his head like a small litany and returned to the room where the monitor hummed its steady lifeline. Caleb took Naomi's hand in both of his now, the raw, private thing that needed no office or badge to authenticate it. He pressed his forehead to hers for a long, steady beat, and in that small space between breaths, the world that had shrunk to a roadside joke and a wet fabric rearranged itself around this couple. Whatever came next, investigations, headlines, broken careers, apologies that might or might not be sincere, had to proceed without trampling on the quiet miracle that lay in the curve of a body and the tiny heartbeat on a monitor. He sat then, a sentinel of one small sacred human fact, that the hospital would not be the place where dignity died. If justice required muscles, he would use them. If it required patience, he would find it. In the bright, indifferent light of the emergency room, Caleb folded his two obligations into one steady resolve. He would answer for the man with a badge, and he would answer for the husband. In those answers, he hoped, the town might find a kind of healing, slow, necessary, true. Afternoon settled across County General like a soft verdict, long gold lines of sunlight leaning through the slatted blinds, the smell of disinfectant mellowing into the more domestic scent of linen warmed by machines. Outside, the world was rehearsing its noises again. Cars in the distance, the faint wail of another ambulance, the low murmur of a radio at the nurse's station. Inside room 214, the air felt suspended, as if the space itself understood that what had been broken required stillness to mend. Naomi Cooper lay awake. The fatigue had retreated but not vanished. It clung to her like the aftertaste of medicine. She had slept for a few hours, enough to give her body back its steadiness, though her limbs still felt foreign, as if borrowed from someone stronger. The IV line hung beside her like a slender companion, dripping patience into her veins. Her eyes traveled over the square of sky visible through the blinds, and fixed for a moment on the slow, circling flight of a gull. It was a ridiculous bird to see this far inland, she thought. Even the improbable had come to witness her day. The door opened with the quiet respect of someone who had learned to enter sick rooms as though stepping into a church. Caleb filled the frame, not by size, though he was a large man, but by the way gravity followed him. He had removed his hat. The badge on his chest caught a splinter of sunlight. The uniform seemed to hang differently now, as if weighed by meanings that had nothing to do with law. He closed the door behind him, and the latch clicked with a sound that felt both final and safe. "You're supposed to be resting," he said softly. The line was habitual, almost domestic, yet underneath it was the quiver of fear that had not found language. Naomi smiled faintly. "I'm trying. Resting is harder than working." Her voice had regained a little strength. She sounded more like herself. He came to her bedside and sat, forearms on his knees, his hands clasped. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was dense with the exchange of things better understood than said. When he finally looked up, she saw what the county never did, the fragile exhaustion behind the calm, the man beneath the badge. "They told me you're improving," he said. "The doctor thinks another day and they'll discharge you." She nodded. "The baby's fine, they said." I heard the heartbeat. It was strong. The words were steady, but her eyes shimmered. That sound, after everything, it felt like forgiveness. He reached for her hand, and the contact steadied them both. Her skin was cool now, not the frightening heat of the roadside. He rubbed his thumb gently across her knuckles. "Forgiveness," he repeated, tasting the word. "You always go straight there." Naomi's gaze shifted toward the window. "Because the alternative sits heavy, Caleb. Anger keeps the body awake when it needs to heal." He exhaled through his nose, the ghost of a sigh. "Anger's part of what keeps the county awake, too. Without it, justice falls asleep." She turned back to him, studying his face. "Justice," she said quietly. "Or revenge?" The question hung in the room like a third presence. She wasn't accusing him. She was naming the fork in the road that had already appeared in both their minds. Caleb's eyes darkened, not with temper but with the awareness of the line she had drawn. He leaned back, the chair creaking beneath his weight. "I saw the footage," he said finally. "Someone filmed it. People film everything now. I watched 2 men I trained turn you into a sideshow." His tone was calm, but his hands had clenched into fists on his thighs. They laughed. "I heard it." Naomi closed her eyes. She had not wanted him to see it, but she also knew there would be no keeping it from him. "Then you know enough," she said softly. "Don't let the rest of it eat you." "They wear my badge," he said, each word measured. "That laughter has my seal on it, the county's crest on their sleeves. How do I not answer that? By remembering you're not them." The simplicity of her reply found its way through the tangle of his thoughts like a small, sharp light. He looked at her again. This woman who, even bruised and bandaged, managed to sound like the calm at the end of a storm. "They'll face discipline," he said. "Internal Affairs is already collecting statements. There'll be hearings, reports, the whole tedious march. But part of me—" He stopped himself, looked down at the floor. "Part of me wants to walk into that squad room and make them feel what you felt." Naomi's fingers tightened around his. "And then what?" she asked. "You break 2 men and lose yourself with them? The county needs a sheriff, Caleb. I need a husband. Don't trade one for the other." He let the words settle. She had always had a way of talking him back from the ledge without ever raising her voice. He stared at the blinds. A line of light drew itself across his sleeve like a quiet warning. "You make it sound easy," he said. "It's not easy," she replied. "It's necessary." A nurse entered then, checked vitals with efficient politeness, and left again. The interruption gave the conversation a natural pause. Outside, the shift change bell rang faintly from some distant corridor, marking the hour when day nurses traded duty with the night. Naomi listened to it with the trained ear of someone who had lived by such bells. It made her smile without humor. "Funny," she said, "how even in a hospital everyone's measuring time." Caleb followed her gaze. Time's what we've got to use carefully now, before this grows into something we can't control." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, an early internal report, already smudged from handling. "The 2 men are under suspension. The department's waiting to see how public this gets. It's all politics now." Naomi nodded slowly. "It will go where it wants. The world likes its simple stories, guilty men, broken women, angry husbands, but our lives are messier than headlines." He looked at her, surprised by the bitterness under the calm. "You sound tired of mercy." "I'm tired of teaching it," she said. Then, more softly, But I won't stop practicing it." He smiled, small and sad. "That's what makes you braver than the rest of us." For a while they sat in silence. The monitor's pulse became the room's clock. Outside, daylight thinned into amber. The window turned the parking lot into a rectangle of reflection. Caleb reached out and adjusted the blanket over her shoulder, the gesture automatic, tender. Naomi caught his wrist before he could withdraw. "Promise me something," she said. "Anything. When this becomes ugly, and it will, don't forget the way it feels right now. Quiet, honest. The world will want noise and anger. But that won't heal what they took. I want you to fix what's broken, not destroy what's left." He nodded slowly, understanding the terms of her plea. "You have my word," he said. And then, after a beat, "But they will answer, Naomi, not because you're my wife, but because you're a citizen of the county I swore to protect." "That's all I ever wanted," she said, eyes shining. Not tears, but clarity. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. A deputy appeared at the door, hat in hand, uncertain whether to interrupt. Caleb rose halfway, motioning for him to speak. "Sheriff," the man said quietly, "the press has the video. It's on 3 local stations already. They're asking for a statement." Naomi watched the exchange, saw her husband's jaw set. "Tell them," Caleb said, "that this department will speak after the evidence is reviewed. And tell them to remember the woman in that video is a patient recovering, not a symbol." The deputy nodded and withdrew. The door closed again, leaving the echo of authority behind. Naomi reached for his hand once more. "You can't control what they see," she said, "but you can control what you become." He bent and kissed her forehead, a gesture that carried apology and oath in equal measure. "Then I'll become what you need me to be," he said. Her smile this time was genuine. "Good. Because I need you steady." He looked down at her, memorizing the calm, the slow rhythm of her breath, the faint rise and fall under the blanket, the strength disguised as stillness. Outside the window, the last of the sun sank behind the county hills, gilding the horizon in a wash of fire. It painted the hospital walls in a light that looked almost merciful. For that hour the room held its balance. Love without sentimentality, resolve without rage. Beyond the glass, the town prepared for its evening news, for judgment and gossip and all the noise the world makes when it thinks it has seen enough to decide. But inside, between husband and wife, there was only the deliberate quiet of people who know that true justice begins not in outrage, but in the refusal to let cruelty define them. Caleb called the meeting with a summons that required no ceremony. An email flagged urgent, a terse radio message, and the old-fashioned word passed by word of mouth through the precinct's corridors, until the briefing room filled like a tide. The room itself was an instrument of authority, rectangular, fluorescent lit, with a long table scarred by years of elbow rests and the dull impressions of coffee cups. A wall-sized whiteboard held the map of Mason County in blue marker, pins indicating patrol beats and recent calls. It was in this utilitarian space that the machinery of order would be made to face its own small failure. Deputies arrived in 1s and 2s, uniforms crisp, although some collars betrayed the day's heat. Faces ranged from young to seasoned. The air carried the low, contained energy of people about to be given instructions. Some wore the casual defensiveness of men unaccustomed to being the subject of their own investigations. Others had the blank, steady look of those who had learned the trade of being watched. Wyatt and Carter entered together, the same tandem swagger now toned down into a careful, practiced posture. They sat at the long table where coffee-stained binders huddled like weathered companions. Caleb stepped into the doorway, and the room shifted. There was no flourish, he never invited one, but the effect was immediate. People straightened not from fear of melodrama, but from the sheer force of presence. He had the look of a man for whom the office was not a uniform state, but a collection of duties he could not leave undone. He moved toward the head of the table and set his palms down with a measured, deliberate motion that suggested the meeting was about to be given shape. "Thank you for coming," he said. His voice filled the rectangular space, neither loud nor private, a tone calibrated for clarity. He met each face in a passing scan the way a man reads allotments of trust in small currency. "We are here because of an incident this morning involving one of our citizens, Ms. Naomi Cooper. I have asked you to be present because we must handle this as an institution, and an institution must be accountable." He did not present his anger as spectacle, nor did he soft-sell the gravity of what had happened. The factual phraseology of his opening did something twin. It anchored the room in procedure and stripped away gossip's liberties. Deputies leaned forward as if the force of his organized calm could become the law's own heartbeat. Caleb continued, "Units in the area were operating today. We will pull all relevant dash camera footage and any body-worn camera footage from those units for review. We will also identify and secure any civilian footage from witnesses near Route 19. This is not optional. I want full cooperation. I expect honesty. If you have information, you will provide it. If you were present, you will complete a written statement. We will not conduct internal politics in the hallway. We will follow our policies and the law." Those words had the pragmatic ring of someone who confesses faith in process rather than theatrics. There was a murmur of assent, but within it threaded the undercurrent of unease. Men shifted in chairs. One or two exchanged looks that held more calculation than concern. For some, the sheriff's insistence on the procedural route was a relief, the found anchor of a predictable, if slow, remedy. For others, it was an implied accusation that the informal immunity of esprit de corps had been suspended. Wyatt coughed politely and tried a small smile, as if to remold the moment into its comfortable shape. "Sheriff, this was a light-hearted thing. Nobody intended harm." His voice sounded like an effort at reason for the group, to reframe the tale as a misstep rather than a moral transgression. Caleb met him with an expression so steady it might have been carved. "Intent does not absolve consequence," he said. "We will assess the facts. We will proceed according to policy." The words landed in the room and drew a thin line through whatever conviviality had existed earlier. Wyatt's smile faltered, like an actor who had lost his cue. Then, with an economy of motion, Caleb signaled to the sergeant on duty. "Sergeant Latham, coordinate the pulls. Start with Units 14 and 17. Contact the bystanders who uploaded footage and secure those devices. Assign deputies Livings and Grant to take initial statements from witnesses at the market and along the stretch of Route 19. His hands moved as he spoke. Small, precise gestures that turned talk into action. No flavors of rumor. Every witness will be asked to provide a written account. Chain of custody will be maintained for all digital media. Internal affairs will be informed and included in the chain." Sergeant Latham, a narrow-faced man who 50 years of precinct life had made efficient if not sentimental, nodded and set his pen to the pad waiting in front of him. The room began to convert talk into task. Men and women rose, distributed themselves into the roles assigned. It was the discipline of an organization that had learned to move in coordinated ways. The machinery of responsibility engaged like gears meshing. Yet beneath the mechanical precision, human lines showed. Some deputies looked relieved to have a role that was specific and manageable. If the sheriff's word contained the guarantee of order, then order could be their anchor. Others, notably those closest to Wyatt and Carter, carried a quieter, harder thought that the case might become a small rupture in the precinct's smooth surface. Rust, long buried in the institution's operations, might be revealed by the tiny act of a water bottle. Caleb observed the room and felt the currents shift. He knew his role required more than policy. It demanded example. "We must hold ourselves to a higher standard than that which the public will perceive," he said quietly. "Do your jobs well. Treat the victim with dignity, and do not allow private loyalties to curtail the truth." At his phrasing, a deputy in the back, a young woman who had earned her stripes through practical stead, raised her hand. "Sheriff, if the men who did this are my partners, how—" She hesitated, measuring the social calculus. "How do we protect the department's integrity while also giving them due process?" Caleb looked at her with an expression that was part commiseration and part iron. "You protect the department by protecting the truth. Due process exists for everyone. We will not punish in the press nor hide in private. We will follow policy and allow the system to do its work. If members of this department have violated our oath, they will face the consequences laid out in our rules and the law. That is how we preserve public trust." The answer satisfied some and unsettled others. To the men who had enjoyed the morning's joke, due process sounded like a slow river that might wash away their impulse to be accountable in the immediate social currency of camaraderie. For those who had long believed in the law as a higher discipline, it was a reassurance. The sheriff would not allow injustice to be muffled. Caleb's voice softened then, and for a moment the meeting took on a private cast. "Also," he said, "we will ensure Naomi and her family are given privacy and support. The town will have eyes on this matter. Reporters will call. I ask that you not speculate in public or on social media. If you're contacted, refer them to me. Do not involve yourselves in commentary or public statements." Silence settled thick as cloth. The instruction hit the room like a commandment that attempted to bind the precinct's gossip-streaked appetites. It was the sheriff's attempt to curtail the wildfire of rumor by circumscribing channels of authority. It was in a way an appeal to the better angels of the force. But nothing of habit is surrendered purely by will. The practical matters took precedence thereafter. Deputies were dispatched with clipboards and cameras, phones were tapped, and the precinct slowly emptied to the routes assigned. Wyatt and Carter lingered, their faces withdrawn like men hit by an unnamed element. Their ease had evaporated. The casual lightness of the morning had hardened into a cooling dread. When the room had thinned, Caleb asked Sergeant Latham to remain. Papers collected and chairs pushed back, the two men remained at the head of the table like custodians of the next chapter. Caleb's outline of action now took on more specific parameters. Secure evidence, coordinate with internal affairs, and prepare a statement that balanced procedural gravity with compassion. He asked Latham to vet the suggested wording and to keep the department's response measured and transparent. After Latham left with a crisp nod, Caleb allowed himself a small pause. He stood and walked to the map on the wall, running a finger along Route 19 as if tracing the line between one human life and the county's long history. The path of the road seemed on the map as a faint, ordinary ribbon. Yet its air that morning had been a theater where small power had been exercised and a person had been humiliated. In the whiteboard's gloss, he could see the town's broader anatomy, its schools, its churches, the county courthouse, and he thought of the way the smallest acts of violence spread outward like ripples. On his desk, a personal phone vibrated, messages of condolence, notes of support from colleagues in neighboring counties, and a small anonymous threat that would be handled by someone else. In the face of the practical tedium of his job, the sheriff felt a private knot tighten. He had always believed in two things: that law ought to be an instrument of measured justice, and that power must be accountable. The day's events had placed him in the crucible where those convictions would be tested. Outside, the county streets moved as they always did. Markets trading, mail being delivered, children at play. But in the precinct's interior, an undercurrent of tension pulsed. The department had been made aware, in the daylight of formal process, that a small cruelty had the potential to expose structural rot. It was Caleb's task to ensure that the department responded in a way that mended rather than tore. He sat then at his desk and drafted the first lines of the official statement. It would emphasize transparency, the department's duty, and a commitment to fairness. He wrote and rewrote, choosing his public words like a man crafting a legal instrument. Behind every phrase lay the knowledge that statements today shape trust tomorrow. When he was satisfied, he sent the draft to the county attorney for review and arranged for an expedited meeting with internal affairs. Late afternoon moved toward evening. The sunlight shifted its angle and softened. The precinct's fluorescent lights hummed to life as night settled. Deputies returned with footage and scribbled notes, and an early, awkward version of the public statement circulated through emails, like a tentative plan. Mason County prepared for the next act: interviews, witness statements, and the slow unpeeling of a morning that, for some, had been a moment of careless performance and, for others, an injury that reached into the marrow. Caleb stayed at the desk until the office emptied. The map on the wall seemed almost indifferent as he traced again the stretch of road. He understood that what the department chose to do now would be measured not only by law but by the court of public opinion. He would choose process and patience over spectacle. He would hold his people accountable, and he would, with a husband's resolve, make sure his family was protected. His hand rested on the phone as if bracing for the calls that would come. Some plaintive, some accusatory, some simply curious. He felt the old weight settle into his shoulders, the responsibility of an office that demanded both restraint and courage. He was prepared in the days ahead to bear the criticism that might come with seeking to be fair in a town that often preferred a quick purge to thorough justice. He understood that true reform would be slow and unpopular, and that the road to it ran through discomfort. When he finally left the precinct, night had established itself. The air was cooler on his face. It smelled of distant rain, though none was forecast. He paused for a moment beneath the station's porch light and inhaled the county's night. The work he had started that afternoon pulling footage, securing statements, preparing statements, would continue. But there was a deeper work he felt called to ensure that the department remained an instrument that served the people, rather than an excuse for a few men's thoughtless cruelties. He drove home that night with a map of the county pressed into his memory, and the weight of the day folded into his mind. Mason County, in its quiet and its small cruelties, had given him a test of character. The uniforms had gathered, and the first ripples of accountability had been cast. What would come next would determine whether the department would bend toward reform or recoil into old habits. Calibrated by duty and guided by love, Caleb resolved to make his choices in a way that would align both. The work he knew had only begun. The interrogation room was a small, deliberately neutral place, the kind of architecture that presumes to erase personality in order to make truth louder. Pale institutional paint, a single overhead fixture, a table with a metallic sheen, and 2 chairs, one for the person who held answers, the other for the person who would be asked to relinquish them. A narrow window cut through the wall, its glass one way, a mouth of shadow through which colleagues and cameras could look but not be seen. The room smelled faintly of floor wax and coffee. The hum of the precinct beyond the door was a distant, indifferent tide. Wyatt Torres and Carter Martinez arrived together. As they had traveled through the morning, tandem figures carrying the residue of bravado in their shoulders. Their uniforms were uncreased, save for a dampness at the collars. Each man's face wore the particular gray of a person who had slept poorly. They were not handcuffed. The sheriff had not come to theatrics. He had come to ask, and to make whatever truth lay in this place choose itself. The restraint of an ordered room, chairs aligned, recorder centered, served to focus attention inwards, onto the small and naked thing of confession. Caleb Young sat across from them, the sheriff's badge folded into the quiet of his jacket like an extra burden. He had not brought anger as a weapon. He had brought a kind of immutable patience. There was power in a man who kept his hands still while the people he questioned fidgeted, and the room felt that power as if it were a change in temperature. A slim recording device lay between them, its red light faint. The promise of permanence is a particular kind of pressure. He opened with something measured and unadorned. "Officer Torres, Officer Martinez, thank you for coming in." His voice had no flourish, only the weight of duty. "This is an official internal interview. I need you to tell me, in your own words, what happened on Route 19 this morning." Wyatt sat with a posture that tried to be casual, the sort of ease that comes from habit and the hope that habit can be made to pass for innocence. He exhaled and began, his story in the rhythm of justification. "We saw her walking, Sheriff. Heat, looked bad. We offered a ride. It was supposed to be a laugh, just a little ribbing, meant no harm. He stopped, searching the sheriff's face instinctively for a permission he would not receive. Carter followed, his voice higher with the tremor of someone who had not yet learned to make fear into a steady thing. "It was a joke." She smiled at first. "It wasn't meant to—" He broke off and swallowed. Caleb listened without rushing. In the pauses between their words, the room gathered additional sound. The faint tick of the clock, the distant call of a dispatcher, the almost imperceptible scuff of shoes on linoleum beyond the glass. Silence, he had learned, could be a kind of instrument. Used well, it encourages people to fill it with truth because concealment is awkward and lonely. "Let me be precise," Caleb said. "You poured water on Ms. Cooper. You did it in public. There is video of the event. There are witnesses. There is a woman who needed dignity, not mockery. Tell me why you thought it was acceptable to treat another human being that way." The question was plain, and it contained more than the sum of its words. It asked for motive and for conscience. It asked them to place themselves in another person's shoes. Wyatt's jaw worked. He looked for the comfort of a shared narrative among his partner's eyes and did not find it there. Instead, there was a gap, a place where 2 men who had laughed together now found themselves reflecting alone. "Youth," Carter offered finally, as if the word were a defensible currency. Boredom. Pressure from the job, maybe. It was dumb. Stupid. We thought it'd break the tension." She looked tired. "We meant to help. Sort of." His hands trembled when he spoke, fingers folding and unfolding as if in private calculus. Caleb's face did not change. He considered the men in front of him as a reader considers a text, attentive to phrasing, wary of omissions, keen on the places where a sentence stops too neatly. Intent does not erase impact, he said. What you call a joke harmed a person. You are sworn to protect citizens. When protection is replaced by performance, the badge becomes a weapon. The words landed like weather. One could imagine them as accusation. In him they were a ledger entry. Simple, precise, recorded. Wyatt and Carter both flinched at the idea of the badge as weapon. They had never considered their laughter in such a frame. We didn't see it that way, Wyatt muttered. You were in uniform, Caleb interrupted softly. You had authority in your sleeves. That is the point. Authority implies responsibility. Do you understand how the public perceives such actions when recorded and shared? The reference to recording was not idle. Caleb reached to the edge of the table and tapped a tablet that had been face down. When he turned it, the bystander video was paused on the frame. A small rectangle of sunlight in motion that showed Naomi at the roadside, the cruiser idling, the arc of water in mid-flight. The image was ordinary in its amateurism, yet stark in its content. Each man looked at the image as if it were a mirror. There was no room left for plausible deniability on the visual plane. The footage converted gesture into undeniable fact. Carter swallowed again, the movement visible in the line of his throat. We looked like idiots, he confessed. It was supposed to be funny. I didn't think... His fingers curled into the palm of his hand. The motion was a child's attempt to stop a storm by squeezing it. Caleb let them breathe in the confession for a moment. Admission loosens the fabric of pretense. It invites the aftermath to speak. He did not punish with rhetorical thunder. He asked instead for their perception. Did you think about her as a person in that moment? Or just a performer in your mourning? The question forced them to examine their internal maps. Wyatt's eyes flickered away, not wanting to see his own reflection in the sheriff's steadiness. I didn't. I saw a uniform, and it changed the frame. Maybe that's the rot. We get used to commanding respect. We forget what we owe. There was a brief, brittle laugh from Carter, uncomfortably human. I should have thought there's a kid in there. A life. Gave me this sick feeling after, like I'd done something real. Caleb listened, and then asked them about procedure. Whether they had any complaints logged, whether they had been directed to offer aid when she declined a ride, whether they had followed the chain of responsibility. The men answered in the technical language of patrol, yes-no affirmations that read like a ledger of actions. But the essential moral question remained unstated and heavy. How does a sense of entitlement erode the duty to protect when the talk threatened to slide into rationalization? We were just trying to lighten the mood, the old refrain of excuses. Caleb used a different instrument. He produced from his folder a printout, the transcript of a witness's video capture, the text of a neighbor's statement, and a grainy screen cap of a social feed where the clip had already collected comments. He did not hurl these like evidence to shame. He set them on the table and let the gravity of permanence do much of the work. The presence of words that had been written by people not even in the room had a peculiar effect. They bore the weight of other eyes, watchers who had no loyalty to the station or its men. Conscience, he knew, could be compelled by the sense that the world was watching honestly. Wyatt's hand went to his temple. We were careless, he said finally. We thought she'd laugh it off. It looked small, Sheriff. But then she collapsed. We didn't mean... He could not finish. The sentence seemed to fail him like a bridge gone awry. You left her there, Caleb said quietly. You drove off. The factuality of the sentence mattered. There was no raised voice, no moral flourish, just a simple naming of what occurred. You had an obligation to act. You had a duty to ensure the person you interacted with remained safe. Carter's face drained. We thought someone else would step in. We thought the EMTs would be called. We didn't think it'd... The rest hung in his throat like smoke. You thought, Caleb said, and the thinking stopped at convenience. He folded his hands over the folder and held the men's eyes. You are neither monsters nor saints. You are officers who made a choice. That choice will now be weighed in the ways our profession and the law allow. The quiet in the room thickened, as if the air itself were collecting testimony. Caleb let the silence sit until it became more than absence. He wanted them to feel how empty a place guilt makes. The men's responses were now smaller, more honest. Apologies that did not attempt to shape punishment. Confessions that read like worn items being set down. The emotional skin they had once pretended under the armor of camaraderie had now been revealed as thin and vulnerable. Caleb moved then, not in a rush, but in a manner that signaled gentle firmness. We will begin with administrative suspension pending investigation. Internal Affairs will conduct the formal inquiry. You will cooperate fully. You will submit written statements. You will surrender any footage in your possession. If you have anything to add, anything at all, this is the time to speak. Wyatt's mouth twitched as if to form a retort. Instead, he nodded. Yes, Sheriff. We'll cooperate. Carter's shoulders sagged. The old performance was gone from him. I'm sorry, he said in a small voice that made the table between them sound like a chasm. It was not theatrical contrition. It was the raw personal recognition of harm. The words trembled but were true. The sheriff did not look triumphant. Triumph would have made him like those who display power for its own sake. Instead, he looked tired, tempered by the knowledge of what constancy required of a man in his station. You will be held accountable, he said. Not because I am your superior, but because you are public servants. People trust us with their safety. That trust is more valuable than any morning's amusement. Then, in a quieter voice that reached beyond procedure into human appeal, he added, Understand that the person you humiliated could have been anyone's mother, wife, sister. She was a patient that day, an exhausted nurse, heavy with life. The world will judge you for what you did, and perhaps rightly so. But the hope remains that you will learn from this in a way that makes you less likely to do harm in the future. For a moment, the room seemed to breathe with the weight of that possibility. A change in character is not often achieved through a single admonition. It is slow work. But the sheriff's words planted the seed of moral consequence. Those seeds, watered by shame and the city's watching eyes, might grow into something like contrition. Caleb rose, the meeting drawing to a close like an evening at the end of a long day. He recorded a list of directives: evidence chain, witness interviews, interviews with dispatch, outreach to County General to ensure Naomi's privacy and protection, coordination with Internal Affairs. He did not need to brandish punishment. The repository of law itself would conduct the next acts. The men left the room with their shoulders different. No swagger, no erasure of the morning's small, sharp event. Instead, they carried the shape of what they had done like a private ledger. As Wyatt and Carter walked back through the precinct's corridor, their steps were irregular, metered by small unease. Around them, colleagues glanced but did not jeer. The station had adjusted to the governor of formal inquiry. The one-way glass that had framed their interview now reflected a corridor where faces watched in sober silence. Outside the room, life continued in the precinct's usual cadence, but something had shifted, a fissure in the quiet code of small allowances. Caleb stayed behind, hands folded on the table, thinking not of kneecaps or retribution, but of the greater task, the slow remaking of institutional habits. Punishment without reform, he knew, leaves the rough wood of system to splinter again. He would ensure the law's machinery ran its course. Yes, but he would also place his energy into training, into conversations about dignity, into the quiet insertion of humanity back into the script of uniformed life. He slid his chair back, turned off the recorder, and waited just a beat longer, taking in the room's small arrangement of light and shadow. The interrogation had done what he had hoped. It had not manufactured a dramatic confession for headlines, but it had opened the men to the sobering clarity of consequence. That clarity, he believed, could become a lever for change. When he walked from the room, he carried with him an exhaustion that was the residue of facing cruelties and turning them into lawful response. The precinct's hum greeted him like an old companion. Outside, Mason County moved on, shops closing, porches cooling, people unaware that inside a small, pale room a ruling of conscience had begun to be rehearsed in slow, precise steps. The county's news vans arrived with the quiet inevitability of weather. First a small crest of activity at the hospital's curb, then a wider swell of cameras and microphones that settled like an intrusive tide. Mason County, which liked to believe itself a place of ordinary grievances and predictable rhythms, found itself at the center of a small, sharp spectacle. The image that had made the rounds, Naomi's soaked scrubs, the arc of water frozen on a handheld screen, traveled faster than the machinery of law could prepare for it. It arrived in living rooms and in church basements and at the diner where mornings are measured by black coffee and the day's gossip. Caleb had chosen from the outset a careful choreography. He understood the power of words released from official mouths and the unsteady hunger of a public that craves resolution like a cure. He had drafted his statement with the slow care of a man arranging tools for a craft, each phrase meant to hold weight without landing as spectacle. He would, he decided, speak plainly, affirm the department's transparency, promise a full investigation, insist on due process for everyone involved, and ask for privacy for Naomi as she recovered. It was the work of a leader who knew that measured tone sometimes frustrates a world that wants theatrical justice, but it also serves a deeper function. It keeps the law legible and therefore defensible. The press conference took place under the courthouse portico, where the county flag snapped at the edge of a breeze and the courthouse steps provided the language of civic ritual. Reporters assembled like birds on a wire, their questions coiled and ready. Caleb stepped up to the lectern with the same slow precision he used to tie his boots. Deliberate, unshowy, disciplined. For a moment he looked like the county itself, solid, appointed, and somewhat weary. "Good afternoon," he began. His voice carried well across the square, clear without being theatrical. "This morning an incident occurred on Route 19 involving Ms. Naomi Cooper. We are grateful she is now under medical care and that her condition is being monitored by professionals." He outlined the department's actions in spare terms: administrative suspension for the involved officers, internal affairs investigation, preservation of all footage, and the department's commitment to transparency. No flourish, no threat. He closed by asking the public for patience and for sympathy for the family involved. Around him, microphones leaned forward like curious mouths. The questions erupted in a practiced storm. "Sheriff, will you fire the officers? Do you believe this was racially motivated? How will you ensure impartiality?" Caleb answered each with the same disciplined grammar. "The department must follow its policies. Evidence will guide actions. The law will be impartial." In 1 or 2 moments his composure frayed, an edge in his jaw, the brief narrowing of his eyes, but it never broke into spectacle. For some in the crowd those responses sufficed. For others they were measured too coolly for moral appetite. As cameras rolled and social feeds blinked into life, the county's chest rose and fell. Activists, who had been slow to organize in the quiet of Mason County, found themselves assembling in the square with placards and quiet chants. An older woman set a single candle at the foot of the courthouse steps and signed her name on a petition. High schoolers threaded themselves between press vans, phones aglow. There was a sense that the small town had been drawn into a larger story about power, about dignity, about the thinness of courtesy when measured against public authority. The sheriff's statement was only the first formal stroke in a longer process. Internally, the department's administrative engine began its precise motion. Suspension notices were served in envelopes whose corners seemed unnervingly sharp in the hush of the locker room. Officers who had once joked over the morning's events now found themselves filling out forms, recounting their actions in measured sentences that would be preserved on file. The internal affairs investigator worked slowly, and with the deliberate neutrality of someone who knows the art of making fact resist rumor. For Naomi and Caleb, the public theater had its own private cost. The hospital room became a fragile island where the world's noises buffeted the door but could not fully enter. She received visitors, family members whose faces were taut with worry, a neighbor who had brought soup and would not speak of the incident by name. And the calls did not stop. Local reporters seeking comment, anonymous messages laced with support, and others threaded with accusation, the predictable intrusion of strangers' opinions into the raw geography of private life. Naomi accepted well wishes with a kind of practiced courtesy that hid the knotted fear beneath. Caleb navigated both worlds with the steady hand of someone who carried 2 maps at once. He made his rounds, court appearances and duty rosters by day, bedside vigils by night, and the strain of the balancing act showed in small, human ways: a missed meal, an unshaven jaw, the way his shoulders lowered for a moment when privacy allowed him a breath. He instructed his public information officer to consolidate messages and to field inquiries to make sure that Naomi's privacy was guarded as strictly as possible, while the department answered for its own. At home, the house they shared seemed both sanctuary and stage. Friends and neighbors called to offer help. Someone left flowers on the stoop with a note of encouragement. A stack of casseroles at the door spoke the language of communal care. Yet not all gestures felt kind. Some slips of rumor circulated in the grocery line, a later glance from a passing neighbor that sounded less like curiosity and more like caution. The couple learned that attention is often an ambiguous kindness. It can protect, but it can also scrape and leave small scars. The case's early legal contours formed in parallel with the human arrangements. The county attorney advised Caleb on preserving prosecutorial integrity while protecting Naomi's right to privacy. Civil liberties groups, alerted by the viral footage, began to inquire about the scope of the investigation. A community organizer asked for a seat at the table to ensure that the voices of the town's people of color were heard. The sheriff, who had initially intended to keep the process strictly within institutional bounds, began to understand that public trust required not only a fair investigation, but also engagement with a community that felt unseen. Within the precinct, fractures showed in small ways. Some deputies, uncomfortable with the glare, banded together in defensive clusters. Others took the sheriff's directives as a mandate to shape themselves. Training schedules were adjusted. Sensitivity workshops were discussed with a cautious earnestness that sometimes read as performative and sometimes as a genuine desire to reform. The department had been built on habits that are hard to change. The process of altering them would be slow and would require more than directives. It would require example, curriculum, and the sometimes boring business of conversation. A week into the public storm, the first internal report came back with preliminary determinations: lapses in judgment, failure to render aid in a timely fashion, violations of departmental conduct. Administratively, the officers' suspensions were converted into pending terminations if improper conduct was proven. Criminal review began to examine whether any prosecutable offenses existed. The legal hammer of official inquiry descended, measured and precise, while a parallel, noisier trial happened in social media feeds and local conversations. The reckoning began to weave through private grief and public process in ways that tested Naomi and Caleb's resolve. They debated, quietly and at odd hours, what justice would look like for them. Naomi's instinct was rooted in repairing, training for empathy at the station, community classes in first aid for expectant mothers, a public platform for maternal safety. Caleb, when pressed, admitted that his instinct pricked with a sharper edge. There was anger, and part of him wanted to see swift public consequences to deter future harm. In the corners of their discourse they wrestled with an old question: whether punishment alone could rebuild the trust that had been torn. The couple's conversations were often a study in balance. They argued in the small, disciplined way of partners who trusted each other's moral compasses. Naomi warned against letting the public's thirst for a quick spectacle trump the need for systemic change. Caleb insisted that without accountability, reform could be mere theater. Together they conceived a middle path: insistence on legal consequence where warranted, coupled with an internal campaign of retraining and community outreach designed to make the force more responsive to the town it served. That plan, born in quiet talk over lukewarm coffee in the kitchen, began to take shape. Caleb authorized an independent review of departmental procedures and budgeted for external trainers. Naomi agreed to meet with young mothers and health advocates to draft an educational program on maternal care in transit situations. What to do when a pregnant person is in distress, how bystanders should respond, how public servants could better assess vulnerability. She wanted the county to learn not only from the moment when cruelty was done, but from the lapses that allowed it to flourish. The public responded with the mixed emotions towns often show when things break open. Some citizens praised the sheriff's even-handed approach. Others demanded immediate firings and public ritual. Local clergy called for calm and for justice. A city councilman used the moment to propose enhanced civilian oversight of the police. At the diner, compacts of neighbors took different positions, and at the church, elders debated where mercy and justice meet. The fracturing of opinion was its own kind of consequence, an unspooling debate that forced the county to confront long-buried tensions. In the center of these ripples, Naomi and Caleb maintained a reserve of domestic rituals that kept their world anchored. They answered calls together when they could. They walked short loops in the evening so that the baby within Naomi might feel the town's air without being subject to headlines. They read children's books with names they would one day give to the child. The smallness of those rituals became a quiet rebellion against the noise outside, a demonstration that life, despite its bruises, continued to insist on tenderness. By the end of the fortnight, Mason County began to feel the first shape of a new normal. The officers remained suspended pending formal proceedings. The Internal Affairs Unit had begun interviews with other deputies. The local paper published a thoughtful editorial asking whether the town was prepared for the kind of reform that required discomfort as its currency. The community meetings that Naomi and Caleb had proposed were scheduled. The hospital agreed to host training sessions on public safety and maternal care. Yet even as the machinery of reckoning moved forward, there were moments of small cruelty that could not be legislated away. An angry message left on the sheriff's office line, a venomous social media comment, a postcard signed only with 2 letters that arrived on the couple's doorstep, SFC, thinly veiled insult meant to make private life bleed into public shame. Those small acts reminded them that although law could demand accountability, it could not repair the raw edges of human hearts overnight. Caleb held to a steady course. He answered with transparency and with procedures designed to keep the investigation clean. Naomi, whose strength had become as visible as it was private, threw herself into the work of prevention and outreach. The county watched, judged, and, in some corners, began to learn. The reckoning had begun as a public unmasking, but had shifted into the less glamorous work of institutional introspection. People would later debate whether the sheriff's choice to pursue measured action rather than theatrical vengeance had been the right one. Some would say that a man in his position should have made an example. Others would affirm that process creates the architecture for lasting change. In the small house on Clay Road, Caleb and Naomi's child stirred at night, a quiet reminder that consequence must always be calibrated by the life it aims to protect. The week closed, with a community meeting under the hospital's small auditorium lights. Citizens gathered, and so did the cameras, because Mason County had found itself in the mood to witness its own attempt at repair. Naomi stood at the podium for the first time since the incident, her face pale but composed. She spoke about dignity and about the fragile economies of care, about how a moment's laughter can break more than a person's composure. It can erode the bridge of trust between a community and those it empowers to keep it safe. Her words landed softly, like seeds cast into soil. Caleb sat in the back of the room, hands folded, watching his wife, and in that watching felt, as any husband does, both an ache and a pride. Outside, the headlights cut through dusk, the county streets settling under the slow, steady canopy of stars. The reckoning had begun. Whether it would mature into reform or retreat into old habits once the cameras left was a question the town now carried like an ember, small, hot, and requiring care. When a moment is small, it often dies like embers under ash. When a moment is caught in a phone's small rectangular eye and set adrift on the sea of the Internet, it becomes weather. It travels, grows, and finds climates where it will widen into storms. The clip of Naomi Cooper, water arcing through heat onto her scrubs, her stance frozen between dignity and shock, left the county with a speed that made the sheriff's office scramble to keep up. What had been a roadside indignity became a national snapshot, a looped frame played in living rooms and newsrooms, nicked and captioned, its edges sharpened by commentary and outrage. It began, as such viral things often do, with a single upload, a shaky camera phone, a hand unsteady from either anger or adrenaline, a clip posted to a community feed with the small barbed title someone thought clever. The uploader was a neighbor who had stood in a doorway and watched the event unfold and had, without thinking beyond the wanting to name it, hit share. That impulsive motion was the seed. Within hours, the recording had been downloaded, reposted, and stitched into 1,000 timelines. Clips with pithy captions, some sympathetic, some mocking, gathered views in the hundreds of thousands, then the millions. Different edits added music. Different frames added textual anger. Where the county expected a whisper, the Internet supplied a roar. Cable shows, hungry for the raw clarity of a simple visual that fit a larger national conversation, spooled the footage amid punditry. Anchors framed the event with sharp leadies about power and racism. Expert panels debated what it said about policing in America. Social media accounts with millions of followers reposted the clip with outrage-smelling tags. Local hashtags became part of national threads. People who had never seen Mason County before found themselves speaking about it as if they had always known its contours. The town's name surfaced in search bars across cities it had never sought. The sheriff's office, which had hoped for a measured investigation and the measured cooperation of its deputies, found itself thrust into the glare. Requests for comment flooded the line. Networks, talk shows, national reporters who wanted sound bites and moral clarity. Caleb Young had anticipated some attention, but not this scale. the machinery he had set in motion, the suspension orders, the internal affairs review, the careful public statement, felt suddenly small against the leviathan appetite of a public eager for outrage. He found himself speaking not only to his county, but to a national conversation that wanted moral verdicts delivered in headlines. Inside the county, predictability gave way to spectacle. Protesters arrived at the courthouse by the dozens, their signs clean and their chants designed for rhythm rather than nuance. People who rarely left their porches learned the liturgy of camera angles and talking points. Counter-protests formed too. Those who believed in law and in the sanctity of the badge lined up with placards that asked the public to withhold judgment until due process had run its course. The town's coffee shops, usually full of morning gossip and harmless complaint, became arenas of argument. Neighbors divided into camps that argued, with the fierce certainty of people who had never believed the other side would ever be right. Threads of commentary wrapped the sheriff and Naomi into symbols, whether they wished to be or not. Naomi became an avatar in the public imagination, an image of vulnerability and of courage in the face of humiliating cruelty. Her name trended alongside terms like maternal safety and policing reform. For some, she was a martyr. For others, she was a rallying cause that could be used to push agendas not strictly aligned with her own life. Images of her walking in the heat, of the water striking her scrubs, were paired with captions calling for sweeping policy changes. The incident's moral clarity and still frames encouraged people to draw extremities of judgment quickly. This is the proof, this is the evidence, this is the outrage. Nuance was an inconvenience in a marketplace that traded in certainty. Caleb watched the storm from the vantage of a man who had placed himself between the tide and the shore, trying to divert its impact from the family anchored behind him. The sheriff's office became the site of a daily choreography. Press releases, carefully staged interviews, the drafting of legalistic responses that could be quoted in 10-second clips without losing necessary complexity. He learned the new skill of translating law into phrases that would not be eaten alive by headlines. He spoke over and over about process and accountability, about the importance of preserving evidence and of not allowing the fire of outrage to replace the cool work of justice. He knew the public demanded catharsis. He also knew that to give them only catharsis and not careful procedure would be to sacrifice systemic truth for transient venting. Journalists camped on the courthouse steps and around the hospital doors. Film crews set up lights beneath the trees on Main Street and interviewed passers-by whose faces had become microcosms of the town's division. National commentators called the sheriff's office for definitive statements as though a single press conference could resolve a nation's accumulated anxieties. Social media users sent messages, some supportive, some venomous, into the sheriff's office inbox. Anonymous notes arrived at Naomi and Caleb's home. Some were casseroles and flowers, others were sealed in the thin. Anonymous barbs of strangers who felt entitled to moral censure without the costs of accountability. For Naomi, the experience of being seen was something both new and ancient. She had lived in Mason County all her life. Being visible to neighbors was ordinary, but to be visible to millions was a different species of publicness. The streams of commentary were a strange ecology, kindness and cruelty intertwined, strangers who cried with her through the screen and strangers who accused her of theatrics. Some threads took her words, brief sentences she had said in interviews about dignity and healing, and turned them into slogans. Her private memories of hospital shifts and midnight prayers had been harvested for public consumption. The intimacy of her recovery was now under a microscope of moral demand. She struggled with the currency of attention. On good days, she felt bolstered by the solidarity, emails from mothers in distant states who had lived through similar shames, donations toward community training she and Caleb had proposed, messages praising her composure. On bad days, each ping of her phone was a small arrow, a harsh comment, a photo of the clip with a new, cruel caption, a demand for naming the men as monsters. The public's desire to fix the world quickly began to feel like pressure on a too tender place. It was as if a town's need to symbolically defeat evil collided with a woman's need for privacy and recovery. The sheriff stood by necessity and habit at the fulcrum between these two needs. He answered calls and gave interviews, but he also held the line for Naomi. He argued with producers about speculative language. He refused to be baited into promises the law could not guarantee. His approach drew both praise and criticism. Some admired the steadiness. Others chastised what they saw as a lack of fiery retribution. Op-eds bloomed. One column praised his emphasis on process as a rare sign of institutional responsibility. Another accused him of protecting the institution at the cost of immediate moral demonstration. Meanwhile, the men in the cruiser who had driven away that morning became the subject of a public feeding frenzy. Their faces, once private, were now public property. Citizens demanded names, demanded accountability, demanded that the badge not be a shield. Social media users collected their histories, old social images, comments, off-duty photos, and presented them as evidence of character. Some callers to talk shows suggested criminal charges. Others wanted them fired, shamed into leaving the town. The precinct's own internal inquiries began to be judged through the lens of public fury, the kind of pressure that can both accelerate and distort institutional processes. Lawyers smelled opportunity in the viral attention, and within days a wave of inquiries came into the sheriff's office. Requests from civil rights attorneys offering to represent Naomi, from national firms proposing to take on class action suits that would weave this incident into larger patterns of policing malpractice. Some of the offers were generous and sincere. Others were opportunistic, and Caleb had to discern where legal help would serve Naomi's recovery and the community's needs, and where it would weaponize pain for spectacle. He declined some offers and accepted others, guided by counsel and by Naomi's own wishes. The distinction between advocacy and exploitation was a line they now walked daily. Outside of courts and newsrooms, the viral storm changed the town's rhythms. Businesses saw customers and boycotts. Neighborhood friendships frayed under different moral alignments. Some people who felt the video exposed a truth they had long suspected felt vindicated. Others who felt the sheriff's team was being ambushed by outsiders leaned into a defensive stance. The small economies of a county, hair salons, diners, gas stations, found themselves mediated by the politics erupting in their booths and at their counters. Yet for all the noise and the fury, the human facts remained. A woman who had been drenched in water and collapsed by a roadside. A child growing inside her. A sheriff balancing duty and devotion. The storm gave the couple a platform they never wanted and a wind they had to endure. Every news cycle made their private life a public exhibit. Every editorial made the county's soul a thing to be adjudicated on television sets across the country. There were, in the tempest, small mercies. Strangers offered resources for maternal care training. A non-profit offered to fund a program Naomi had sketched out in half-joking notes on a napkin. Neighbors brought warm casseroles to the door and wrote notes of quiet support. These gestures, humble and human, threaded themselves through the outrage like lifelines. They reminded Naomi and Caleb that while the internet is a crucible of extremes, actual neighbors still existed, people whose faces they knew and whose hands could be trusted to help. Caleb learned to move through the noise by carving small rooms of privacy. He turned off notifications at night. He limited interviews to carefully chosen outlets. He met with community leaders, ministers, educators, civic organizers, to explain the investigative process and to solicit help with outreach. He refused to allow the viral hunger of strangers to dictate the county's administration of justice. For all the anger demanding immediate satisfaction, he held fast to the belief that a community's long-term trust depends on measured, visible procedure. At the incident's center, Naomi insisted, in public and in private, on the language that mattered to her: dignity, training, prevention. She accepted the empathy and the offers of help, but resisted being turned into a mere symbol. She told reporters that her priority was not the thirst for punishment, but the quiet work of making the county a safer place for pregnant women and the vulnerable. Her statements were themselves a kind of counterweight, gentle, insistently pragmatic, and unexpectedly resolute. As the viral storm hummed and thundered, Mason County learned a new lesson about itself: how fast an image can redraw a town's map, how public anger and private pain can commingle, and how institutions must act not only to answer the law, but to restore fragile trust. The clip of the water in the sun had been a single, ugly note. The symphony that had followed was discordant, complicated, and very human. In the middle of it, Naomi and Caleb sought shelter, not in the applause or the fury, but in the small acts that keep a life steady: a meal shared in silence, the close watching of a fetal monitor, an evening walk around the block to feel the county's air on their faces without thinking about the cameras. The internet fed the fire, but it could not extinguish the private, stubborn fact of a child's heartbeat on a hospital monitor or the daily work of a sheriff who had to hold both law and love in the span of his two hands. The viral storm would run on in headlines and threads for weeks, perhaps months. Yet the couple understood that storms change the landscape they sweep across. They leave new contours in their wake. What mattered, they agreed in a wordless accord, was what would be rebuilt after the wind. The courthouse had always been a symbol of equilibrium for Mason County, a building of white stone and modest grandeur, its columns lined with ivy, and its clock face frozen at a time that rarely matched reality. For decades it had hosted small disputes, zoning arguments, and the procedural rhythm of rural justice. Now it had become something else, a crucible for a community that had spent its patience on anger, and found, to its discomfort, that healing would require more than fury. It was late afternoon when Sheriff Caleb Young walked through the courthouse doors for the public hearing called by the county commission. The summons had been framed as a community forum, but he knew better. It was a trial without a gavel, a stage for the county to test whether it still believed in the difference between leadership and blame. Inside, the main chamber glowed under the antique brass lamps. Rows of wooden pews, usually only half filled for routine sessions, were packed to the walls. Reporters with cameras lined the side aisles. Their lenses drank in every sigh, every twitch. Behind the rail, townspeople filled the benches, some with folded arms, others holding hand-painted placards now rendered unnecessary by proximity. Naomi's image, the still frame of the water's ark, her drenched scrubs clinging to the outline of pregnancy, had circulated too widely to be abstract. Here it had become incarnate in every whisper. She was not present, at Caleb's insistence, still resting at home and trying to recover from the scrutiny that had made privacy a rare commodity. Yet her absence was a palpable figure, a ghost in the room's center. Caleb's entrance was quiet. He carried no papers, no entourage, only the gravity of office and the fatigue of a man whose every word could either steady or fracture a fragile civic faith. He nodded once to the commissioners seated at the long oak dais. 3 men and 2 women, the elected stewards of Mason County's procedural conscience. They looked back with expressions that were equal parts respect and calculation. The chairman, a broad man with the florid complexion of long service, cleared his throat. "Sheriff Young, thank you for attending. The people of Mason County have questions. You understand the public needs answers?" "I do," Caleb said. His tone was even, the practiced calm of a lawman accustomed to crossfire. The chairman gestured. "Then let's begin." The first question came from Commissioner Hale, a man who believed in the neat economy of cause and consequence. "Why?" he asked. "Did your department not immediately terminate the officers involved?" "Suspension looks soft to the public. They see delay as protection." Caleb held his gaze. "Because the law does not trade in spectacle. Termination without process invites reversal on appeal and undermines the principle of due procedure. If I am to uphold the law, I must do it even when it's inconvenient." A murmur rippled through the audience, half approval, half discontent. The commissioner frowned. "So you stand by the suspension?" "I stand by the process," Caleb said. Another voice broke in from the dais. Commissioner Ellery, a woman who had once taught civics before politics claimed her. "Sheriff, some citizens feel this case isn't just about misconduct. It's about systemic bias. How do you address that perception while leading an institution accused of it?" Caleb turned to her, the question sharpening his posture. "By facing it," he said. "By admitting we have patterns that need dismantling. Bias doesn't vanish because a sheriff refuses to see it. I intend to examine training, recruitment, and field supervision, openly, with community oversight. We can't repair what we won't name." Her expression softened slightly, though the tension in the room didn't. The old walls seemed to hum with the twin vibrations of faith and cynicism. Then came the inevitable political question, delivered by Commissioner Hale again. His voice dipped in caution. "The governor's office has reached out. They're concerned about stability. There are murmurs of state review. They advise containment. Containment." The word landed like a rock in Caleb's chest. He heard it for what it was, a polite term for silence. He had expected this. Politics always demands the convenient quieting of noise before elections. The commissioner leaned forward. "You understand what I mean, Sheriff? The state expects this to cool down." Caleb's answer arrived without rehearsal. "Justice doesn't cool down on command," he said. The room reacted as if struck by weather. The murmurs became audible, swelling and receding like the tide. One of the reporters in the side row scribbled furiously. The commissioner's expression flickered between irritation and admiration. Caleb continued, his tone steady but the undercurrent unmistakable. "I was elected to enforce the law impartially. I wasn't hired to manage optics. My wife was humiliated in public while doing nothing more than walking home from work. I cannot turn that into a PR problem to be solved by delay." From the back of the room, a woman's voice called out. "A local teacher, known in the town." "Then what will you do, Sheriff? What happens next?" Caleb turned toward her. The crowd's collective gaze followed. "What happens next," he said, "is the law. The officers will face disciplinary review. If Internal Affairs finds sufficient cause, they'll be referred to the prosecutor. If the evidence supports criminal charges, they'll stand trial like anyone else. We won't rush that process, but we won't bury it either." He paused then, letting silence stretch, a pause that invited thought instead of applause. "But that's only half the work," he continued. "The other half is changing the culture that made two men think humiliation was a form of humor. That means training, transparency, and opening the doors between this office and the people it serves. We will not fix everything with punishment. We fix it by rebuilding trust." There was no applause at first, just the sound of pens scratching, camera shutters clicking, a cough from the rear. Then, slowly, scattered claps began, tentative, then swelling until the noise filled the room. Not everyone joined. Some sat stiffly, their skepticism intact. But enough did to mark a shift in the room's air, a small exhale of something like belief. As the session continued, the commissioners moved on to procedural minutiae. Budgets, oversight committees, timelines, but the central drama had already passed. Caleb's words, clipped and measured, had done what speeches seldom manage. They had reminded people that leadership sometimes means restraint, and that conscience is lonelier than applause suggests. When the meeting adjourned, the crowd spilled into the courthouse steps where night had gathered in soft blue layers. The square was alive with talk. Some praised the sheriff's courage. Others accused him of showmanship. Reporters fed live updates to distant audiences who would parse his sentences into headlines by dawn. Inside the courthouse, Caleb lingered in the now empty chamber. The rows of benches looked exhausted by their own listening. He sat briefly in one, elbows on knees, and stared at the polished floorboards that reflected the faint overhead light. Leadership, he thought, was not about certainty, but endurance. You carried the weight of public anger until it reshaped you, then carried what was left into tomorrow. He rose and walked to the window that overlooked the square. Protest signs swayed in the half-dark, and for the first time he felt less like their target and more like their custodian. People wanted the same thing, he realized. They wanted the world to make sense again. His task was to make sure that in the pursuit of justice, the county did not lose its humanity. As he turned to leave, footsteps echoed behind him. Commissioner Ellery had returned, her coat folded over one arm. "You know," she said quietly, "they'll come after you for this. The ones who think calm isn't leadership." Caleb nodded. "Let them. Anger burns quick. I can wait it out." "You're standing alone," she said. "That's the job," he replied. She hesitated, then smiled, faint but sincere. "Then you're the right one to have it." Outside, the courthouse clock struck 9. The bell's sound carried over the roofs and into the streets, where crowds were thinning and the first stars found their bearings above the courthouse dome. Caleb stepped into the night, his breath clouding in the cooling air. The town's noise followed him only halfway. The rest belonged to silence and the long road home. At the house, Naomi sat by the window, the glow of a muted television flickering across her face. She turned when he entered, reading everything in the set of his shoulders. "It went as it needed to," he said, lowering himself beside her. "They'll listen?" she asked. "Enough will," he answered. She reached for his hand, her fingers light against his. The storm outside might rage for weeks, but here, in the quiet hum of their shared space, there was something unmovable. He looked at her, this woman who had become both wound and compass, and felt the day's exhaustion settle into clarity. They called it a forum, he said, but it felt more like confession. She smiled faintly. "Confession's only useful if it leads to change." He nodded, his gaze drawn to the window where the courthouse lights dimmed one by one. "Then maybe that's where we start. They sat there together, hands clasped, listening as the county's distant murmurs faded into night. The trial of conscience had begun, not in courtrooms or hearings, but in hearts slowly awakening to their own responsibilities. It was an unglamorous work, and it would take time, but Caleb and Naomi, bound by faith and scarred by experience, understood what most of the county did not yet. Real justice doesn't shout. It endures. The night the child arrived, Mason County seemed to hold its breath as if, for once, the town had invited silence instead of spectacle. The streets, which had been leached earlier by the bright streaks of press vans and the restless pedestrians of protest, had settled into a hush that made the ordinary sounds, an owl, the distant churn of a late truck, the low murmur of late-night radios, seem fuller, more human. In the small house on Clay Road, the lamps were low. The air felt soft with waiting. Naomi and Caleb had arranged the room the way two people arrange a promise. Blankets folded where they might be needed, a chair for the sheriff that had become a kind of sentinel, the small fetal mobile they had bought months earlier casting a gentle shadow over the crib. For Naomi, labor arrived not as a single event, but as a series of small, converging urgencies. The first wave was a memory-sharp contraction that stole breath and left a ringing pain behind it. The second was a tide of fear thinly held in place by practiced breathing. Her body moved with the ancient private logic of women whose bodies know the root by instinct. Each contraction was a syllable in a language she understood without translation. She had delivered before, this would be no stranger to her, but the world outside had been altered by a day's cruelty, and the arrival of a child in the middle of that public commotion felt like both a challenge and an answer. Caleb was steady in the way he had been since the first morning, a man who could set his hands where needed, and whose restraint had become a kind of armor. He had arranged for a small team from County General to be on call at the house, an allowance he had secured quietly, not to court the pomp of private medicine, but to ensure that Naomi would have care without the cruelty of cameras in the hospital halls. They had argued, briefly and tenderly, about the rightness of that decision. Naomi's concern had been true to form, that nothing should be about appearances, that the child's first breath should not be given in the shadow of spectacle. Caleb had argued that safety required prudence. In the end, they had agreed on a middle ground: privacy, preparedness, and the decision to let the child's arrival be clinical in method and sacramental in feeling. The first hours of labor were contained in a kind of intimate geometry: a hand to hold, a basin of cool water, the soft voice of a midwife counting and coaching, the metronome of a monitor that recorded heartbeats like an old hymn. Caleb moved in a choreography of steady care: warm cloths at the brow, a whispering encouragement in short syllables when Naomi's breath faltered, a palm steady on the small of her back. The world outside tried to make itself heard: the distant chime of someone yelling into a phone, the faint drone of a camera van idling half a town away. But inside the house the sound of life took priority. The monitors kept a small, steady line that reassured in its rhythm. The child inside moved with a stubborn insistence that was almost mocking in its ordinariness, as if to say, "I will come in the midst of noise." As labor intensified, so did the psychological pressure. Caleb checked his phone less often than he had at the start, an act of discipline. Yet the universe had its own ways of intruding. A neighbor, Mr. Harlow, the same man who had steadied Naomi on the bridge, stood guard by the kitchen doorway with 2 hot thermoses and an expression that spoke of small, solemn duty. He nodded at the sheriff in the way neighbors do when they communicate without saying much. "We will hold watch." The sheriff's radio lay unworn on the table, its presence a sign that duty had not been abandoned, but had receded into the station of priorities that love dictates. At the hospital, a different drama played out. The internal affairs team worked with methodical care, preserving footage, collecting statements, and liaising with legal counsel. The press asked questions that sometimes smelled of hunger more than concern. Pundits on the long-distance channels argued about the meaning of the incident as though the human inside the frame were a thought experiment. The county's leaders moved through the week with the measured steps of men and women used to governance in crises, procedural, sometimes blind to the human thread winding through it. All that machinery was necessary. Caleb had not been naive about the need for order. Yet, as the hour of birth approached, he felt the machinery of law grow both small and large. Small because it could not ease Naomi's pain in that exact moment. large because its work would shape the life the child would be born into. In the house, the rhythm of labor moved like surf. Naomi breathed through each contraction with a practiced fortitude, at times curling inward in a way that demanded reverence. Tears came as they often do in labor. Unannounced, honest, a quiet offering of what the body and soul can no longer hold. Caleb leaned close, his face a map of exhaustion and awe. Words were not enough. His presence had to be action. A finger pressed to a wrist, a promise murmured between breaths, the careful rubbing of an aching toe. When the midwife announced that the child was crowning, a phrase that always made Caleb breathe a different kind of breath, the room seemed to suspend itself. The world outside paused in a way that felt almost sacramental, as if the town itself had bent to hear the small, fragile thing move into being. Lights were adjusted, the camera phone, promised to be off, was turned face down on a table, a small act of defiance against the world's appetite for image. Naomi, with a sophistication carved by pain and courage, reached for Caleb's hand and held it as if she could anchor both of them in the same heartbeat. The final push came with a sound that was both animal and human. Naomi bore down with a force that was the result of every hard hour she had worked, every shift she had taken in service of others, every humiliation she had endured that day. Caleb's hand tightened. His knuckles whitened as if in prayer. The midwife's voice blurred into a steady incantation of instructions, and then the child was there, slippery and noisy and uncompromisingly alive. The first cry was not the question the couple had feared. It was an answer. A tiny stamp of existence that asked nothing from the world but air and the warmth of two hands. Naomi's cry came then, a sound of release that carried within it a strange mixture. Relief, gratitude, the ache of vulnerability, and the wild, unformed joy that arrives when a long wait is finally over. The midwife placed the newborn on Naomi's chest, and a hush came over the room that had nothing to do with the world outside. For a moment, the political stories, the press vans, the social feeds, and the department's troubles were all reduced to silence, irrelevant in the face of a small life asserting itself. Caleb bent, eyes wet in a way that men rarely allow to be seen in public, and kissed Naomi's forehead. He looked at the child with the fierce pride and fragile tenderness of a father who had already pledged himself to protect innocence. In the newborn's tiny hands he saw the future he promised to guard, not just for his family but for the values he wanted the county to honor. The infant, pink and vigorous, turned its head and blinked, as if testing curiosity left to its tender devices. For Naomi and Caleb, the moment felt like a kind of reckoning in reverse. After a morning of humiliation and a week of public storm, a private miracle had arrived that demanded a gentleness no headline could provide. Outside, a stream of callers had to be fielded. The sheriff's phone rang a dozen times in those first incandescent minutes. A public information officer filtered messages and turned off microphones when necessary, providing space that felt, in its own small bureaucratic fashion, like protection. Caleb allowed himself the luxury of letting most of it be handled by others. He sat with Naomi, cradling the newborn close, feeling the steady beat of a tiny heart against his palm. Around them, the midwife checked vitals, and the nurse prepared the little cloths that would be the baby's first linens. Mr. Harlow, who had been a silent sentinel, offered a small, embarrassed smile and tucked a warm biscuit into the midwife's hand. The first hours after birth were wrapped in the ordinary rituals of new life. Skin to skin, the tentative first latch, the quiet counting of fingers and toes, and the slow closing down of a day's adrenaline into a sleepy devotion. Naomi held the child like a person holding a fragile promise. Her face, tired and luminous, was a portrait of someone who had survived both cruelty and the hard, redemptive work of bringing life into the world. Caleb watched them both as if memorizing the angle of a cheek, the way a hand curled when half asleep. He knew the smallness of these details would be called upon later as evidence of what a life of care could look like. Later that night, when the house had settled, and the child slept in the curve of Naomi's arm with a contented, oceanic rhythmicity, the sheriff stepped outside onto the small porch. The air was cool, the moon hung behind a gauze of cloud. He looked toward the town and felt for a long moment the strange mixture of responsibility and humility that governs those who are called to lead. The day's earlier challenges, the viral storm, the public outrage, the political pressure, felt very distant from the quiet domestic tableau before him, yet he knew they were not gone. They would return in the morning's light with subpoenas and statements and the slow work of law. He cradled the baby's first blanket in his hand and whispered, not to the child, but to himself, the promise that had become his compass. To see that the law he administered would protect the fragile and condemn the reckless. To see that the county would not allow the petty, performative cruelties of a few to define the common weal. He would guard both, in public with procedure, in private with love, and hope that the two could meet in the middle. Inside, Naomi slept with the newborns breathing like a lullaby in her chest. Her face, softened by the recent miracle and the long relief of survival, reflected a woman who had been remade in small ways by the day's pain. When she woke later and saw Caleb there, watchful and tender, she smiled in a way that was enormous and private. "He's beautiful," she whispered, voice raw. He's perfect." Caleb laughed softly, a small, half-broken sound. "Perfect," he repeated. "We did a good job." His words sounded both foolish and enormous at once. Parenthood compresses pride and humility into the same breath. As dawn took a tentative hold, the county's noise would find its way back through the doors and into their lives. The press would want interviews, the department would want reports, and the human business of justice would proceed like a neighbor sending a polite but insistent letter. But for this narrow, incandescent hour, the family held its small, hot mercy close. The child's first days would be a living testament to what they hoped Mason County might become, a place where care outranks cruelty, where dignity is restored, and where the small life that had arrived amid chaos might one day walk through the town not burdened by its mother's humiliation, but buoyed by the resolve of a community determined to do better. Outside, Mr. Harlow leaned on his cane and watched the house's window glow like a small, steady lantern. He tipped his hat to the quiet and walked home under the moonlight. In the distance, a cameraman adjusted his van's lights, a mechanical, oblivious motion that for a moment seemed comical against the tenderness of the scene. The world would continue to turn, to judge, to rage, but in that house on Clay Road, the sheriff and the nurse sat together with a newborn between them, and for tonight at least, the weight of public drama had been replaced by the softer, stronger gravity of a family choosing to be whole again. Morning broke over Mason County with a strange, brittle stillness, the kind of quiet that follows storms not because the world is calm, but because it is holding its breath. The courthouse square stood nearly empty, its flag at half-staff in memory of something intangible, perhaps innocence, perhaps ignorance. The protests had thinned to scattered clusters. The news vans, hungry for new drama, had begun to drift toward other towns. But inside the precinct and the courthouse, the reckoning that had been promised was finally taking shape. The legal machinery that Caleb had set into motion weeks earlier was now a living, breathing thing. Files had multiplied. Statements had been transcribed. The video footage that had once shocked the world had been downloaded, time-stamped, and submitted as evidence. The process was slow by design. Law insists on procedure even when morality screams for haste. And yet the gravity of it drew people into a kind of watchful awe. Everyone in Mason County knew what day it was, the day the men who had poured water on a pregnant woman would be asked to account for themselves before the public they had betrayed. The courtroom itself had the same character as any small-town tribunal. Wooden benches, the faint smell of dust and paper, the echo of shoes on tile. But on that morning it carried the atmosphere of ritual. Reporters sat in the back row, notebooks balanced on knees, microphones clipped to jackets. Townspeople filled every pew, their silence thick with a mixture of expectation and disbelief. Wyatt Torres and Carter Martinez sat at the defense table, their faces drawn into the ashen mask of men who have finally run out of excuses. Their suits were too formal, their collars too stiff, as if the costume of remorse might substitute for the feeling itself. Each man had lost weight. Their swagger had collapsed into the posture of waiting for an outcome already half-written. Between them and the sheriff's table stood the thin aisle that divided public servants from the citizens they were meant to serve. The irony was visible even to those who did not know how to name it. Caleb arrived last, dressed in his formal uniform. The dark navy pressed so sharply it seemed to cut through the stale air of the room. The badge on his chest gleamed like an act of defiance. He did not sit with the prosecution. though he had been invited to. He chose instead a seat near the back among the townspeople. To lead meant to witness, not to gloat. At the front of the room, the county prosecutor, a woman named Dana Kell, stood with a thin folder in her hand. Her voice, when she began, was even and spare. "Your Honor, the state submits that Officers Torres and Martinez engaged in conduct unbecoming, in violation of both department code and the laws of this state. They abused their authority. They humiliated a citizen under color of law. Their actions led to bodily harm, psychological trauma, and the public erosion of trust." The judge, an old man with a tired dignity, nodded for her to proceed. Kell's tone was not theatrical. She simply laid down fact after fact. The footage played again on the screen for the record. That same slow-motion cruelty that Mason County had already memorized. The gleam of water, Naomi's stunned stillness, the laughter that had no conscience in it. There were no gasps this time, only the low, exhausted sound of a town finally seeing its reflection without filters. Then came the testimonies. First, the paramedic who had found Naomi on the roadside, his voice steady, his memory exact. Then Mrs. Danvers from the market, describing the look on Naomi's face. Not shock, but something quieter and worse, a resignation. And finally, a statement from Naomi herself, read aloud by the prosecutor because she had chosen to remain home with the newborn. Her words were short, handwritten, without ornament. "I do not hate them. I pity what they've become. But pity is not the same as forgetting. If our laws mean anything, they must mean that dignity belongs to everyone, even those without power to demand it." The courtroom was silent after that. Not the restless silence of people waiting to speak, but the deeper quiet of people realizing they had nothing left to add. Then came the defense. The attorneys spoke with the clumsy carefulness of men paid to find nuance where there was none. They invoked youth, stress, the pressures of the badge, the heat of the morning. They called it a momentary lapse, a misjudged act of humor. It was perhaps the best they could do with the scraps left to them. Even Wyatt and Carter looked unconvinced as their lawyers spoke. Their eyes darted toward Caleb more than once, as though seeking a signal of forgiveness that would not come. When the judge finally invited them to speak for themselves, Wyatt stood first. His voice cracked not from emotion but from exhaustion. "I don't have a defense," he said. "I thought I was better than the men who abuse power. I wasn't. I laughed when I should have helped. I watched her fall and I drove away. I see that every night. I deserve what's coming." Carter rose next, trembling slightly. "I followed him," he said, nodding toward Wyatt. "But no one forced me. I thought we were just blowing off steam. I didn't see the person. I just saw the uniform. That's what shames me most, that the job made me forget who I'm supposed to be." The judge let the silence do its work before responding. "The court finds that remorse, however sincere, cannot erase harm. The badge does not grant immunity from decency." He pronounced sentence, termination from duty, 1 year of supervised probation, mandatory community service under the supervision of the sheriff's office, and enrollment in restorative justice programs. It was not the heavy sentence some had demanded, but it was deliberate, designed to be lived with, not simply endured. A few in the gallery murmured disapproval, wanting blood, not reform. But others, especially those who understood Caleb's approach, recognized what had been done. Justice had not been traded for vengeance. It had been humanized. Caleb watched the men led from the courtroom. Their shoulders were slumped, their steps uneven. They looked neither defiant nor destroyed, only emptied. He felt no triumph, only a grave steadiness. When the gavel fell, the noise sounded not like closure, but like the dull punctuation of inevitability. Outside, reporters waited with their notebooks poised. Caleb stopped on the courthouse steps and gave the same kind of statement he always gave. Plain, controlled, exact. The law has spoken. The verdict stands. What matters now is what we learn from it. This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. Mason County will continue to rebuild its trust, one act at a time. The microphones caught every word, but they could not catch what lingered in his expression. The fatigue of a man who had spent himself on endurance. Later that evening, Caleb drove to the hospital. Naomi was sitting in a chair by the window, the baby asleep in her arms. The soft buzz of a heart monitor filled the room with the rhythm of continuation. When he entered, she looked up and read the verdict in his eyes before he spoke. "It's done," he said simply. "They confessed. They're out." She nodded, neither smiling nor sighing, only absorbing the information like a person who has already accepted that the world moves by small corrections, not grand repairs. "That's enough," she said. "Let it end there." He crossed to her, leaned down and kissed her temple. The baby stirred, blinked, and stretched a tiny hand toward him, the fingers curling around the air. Caleb smiled despite himself. "He doesn't know the world's fixed yet," he said quietly. Naomi's laugh was soft but real. "Then let's teach him to fix it anyway." They sat like that for a long time. The sheriff, the nurse, and the child whose birth had split open a town's conscience. While outside, Mason County began its slow return to ordinary life. The courthouse lights dimmed, the reporters packed their equipment, and the wind carried away the last echoes of protest chants that had lost their urgency. The reckoning had come, and with it something quieter and more durable, the beginning of understanding. Justice, Caleb thought, was never about noise. It was about what remained standing after the noise had gone. Morning light washed over Mason County with the gentle clarity of a place trying to remember itself. The storm had passed, not vanished, but thinned into the kind of quiet that follows repentance. The courthouse lawn, once crowded with cameras and banners, now bore only the marks of footsteps on soft grass. The air felt lighter, as though the town, in its bruised way, had begun to breathe again. Inside the sheriff's office, the smell of fresh paint lingered. The front desk gleamed with new polish, a visible metaphor for change. Posters about community outreach lined the bulletin board. "Serve with dignity. Every citizen is a neighbor." In the training room, a small group of deputies sat in new uniforms, notebooks open, listening as an instructor from the city spoke about empathy and restraint, about reading faces as well as laws. Caleb Young watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softened by something like pride. For the first time in months, the department no longer felt like a burden on his shoulders. It felt like a responsibility being shared. Each man and woman in that room was learning the thing their predecessors had forgotten, that power is not strength unless it bends toward mercy. He crossed the hall to his office, where sunlight poured through the blinds in gold stripes across the floor. On his desk sat a framed photograph of Naomi and their newborn, taken just a week earlier in the garden behind County General. The baby's face was half hidden in Naomi's arms, his small hand gripping her finger like a promise. Caleb traced the edge of the frame with his thumb. A knock on the door broke the reverie. It was Commissioner Ellery. She smiled in that slow, measured way of hers. "I just came from the council meeting," she said. "They've approved your proposal. The Community Partnership Program starts next week." Caleb's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile. "We'll need to make good on it." "I think you already have," she replied. Then, after a pause, "How's Naomi?" "She's healing. The baby's stubborn." "That's genetic," Ellery said, half smiling. "And you?" He leaned back in his chair. "Tired, but it's a good kind of tired." They shared a silence that wasn't awkward. Then she added quietly, "You know, you've changed this place more than anyone realizes. That's rare for a man who doesn't raise his voice." Caleb looked at her, thoughtful. Maybe it's time people learned that quiet can lead too. She nodded, left the room, and closed the door softly behind her. That evening, the community center on Clay Road buzzed with life. The sheriff's office had organized a town meeting, the first of its kind since the incident. The turnout was overwhelming. Families, clergy, teachers, and children gathered under the warm hum of fluorescent lights. Folding chairs creaked, coffee cups steamed, and for once the crowd's murmur carried no hostility, only curiosity. Naomi stood at the front of the room, still a little pale but radiant with purpose. Her baby slept in a bassinet beside the podium, an emblem of fragile beginnings. When she spoke, her voice filled the space with a calm that demanded attention. "Thank you for coming," she began. "When I think back to that morning, I remember the heat, the fear, and the feeling of being unseen. But I also remember the hands that helped, the old man who stopped his truck, the paramedics who rushed me to the hospital, and the people who reached out from this very town. Those acts of care are why I'm standing here. They are what I want to carry forward." She gestured toward the banners behind her, Neighbors First Initiative, and Maternal Safety Outreach. "The sheriff's office has agreed to partner. with the hospital to train every officer in medical response, crisis empathy, and maternal health. We can't change the past, but we can build something new from it. A quiet ripple of applause spread through the room, humble but sincere. Then Caleb stepped forward. The sight of him in uniform drew an instinctive hush. He looked out over the sea of faces, familiar ones, skeptical ones, hopeful ones, and when he spoke, it was in the same even tone he used when delivering hard news or soft truths. "This town has seen the worst of itself," he said, "but it's also seen its best. We've learned that justice isn't a gavel, it's a habit. It's the decision to treat every person like they matter, even when nobody's watching. My promise to you is simple. Mason County's law will never again humiliate where it should protect or silence where it should listen. We'll rebuild trust the way we lost it, one act at a time." There was no roar of applause this time, only the sound of hands meeting hands, slow, deliberate, sincere. People rose to their feet not in celebration but in acknowledgement. For a moment, the sheriff's badge seemed less like an emblem of authority and more like a reflection of the community's own endurance. After the meeting, the young family walked home under a quilt of stars. The baby fussed softly against Naomi's chest, his breath small and rhythmic. The night smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen. They moved in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't need filling. When they reached their gate, Caleb paused. The street lamp overhead flickered, bathing them in alternating light and shadow. "You know," he said quietly, "I keep thinking about how it started, with a bottle of water, a cruel laugh, a small choice, and how it ended, with this." He gestured toward the sleeping town, the faint glow of windows where people still talked about hope. "I don't know if that's redemption, but it feels like direction." Naomi smiled faintly. "Redemption isn't an ending," she said. "It's maintenance." He laughed softly, the sound blending with the rustle of leaves. "You always get the last word." "Only when I'm right," she teased. They reached the porch. Caleb turned, looking out at the quiet town, and exhaled. The lights of the courthouse blinked in the distance, steady and subdued. The same building that had once echoed with accusation now stood as a monument to perseverance. He felt, for the first time in months, the burden on his shoulders ease, not disappear, but settle into something manageable, even noble. He placed a hand over Naomi's where it rested on the baby's back. "He'll grow up here," he said softly, "in this town. I'll make sure it's a place he can be proud of." Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder. "That's your promise, then?" Caleb nodded, eyes on the horizon. "That's my promise." Inside, the baby stirred and sighed, his small sound filling the night like a benediction. Caleb smiled, reached over, and opened the door. Behind them, Mason County exhaled, its scars still visible, its conscience still tender, but its heart beating steady again. The water on the road had long since dried. In its place was something harder to wash away: understanding. And as the sheriff carried his child inside, the porch light flickered once, then steadied, burning with the soft, enduring glow of renewal.